Chapter 167. According to Feng Yu's theory, the human body was the first machine. Whether it was a mecha or a battleship, they were all just extensions of the human body. Those cold metal components, complicated circuitry chips, and terrifying firepower had to listen to the orders of the human body and obey the orders of the human body. Just like driving a car, no matter how fast the car was, the driver's hands still determined the direction of the car. If one explored this direction, they would find a very important link. How did the human brain's activities and commands be transmitted to various machines? The human alliance had been developing for many years. From the earliest days of manual control, to the input of data command programs, to the research of human simulators that had been abandoned halfway through. This was a very important aspect, but there had never been a revolutionary change. On the battlefield between the Federation and the Empire, in the mecha that climbed the mountains, and in the giant battleships in the darkness of space, humans were still using these methods to convert their will into powerful energy through cold metal. Take the M-series mecha, which represented the Federation's engineering standards, as an example. They had always used a touch screen to operate the mecha. The mecha's operation mainly tested the pilot's judgment ability and the input speed of the program. After the M-series mecha entered the 5th generation, an additional auxiliary control lever was added to the lower left hand of the control cabin. The scientists of the Federation had once tried to use sensitive data-gathering microprocessors to cover the entire body of a pilot, directly capturing the minute movements of every inch of the pilot's skin. Then, the signals would be transmitted to the central control computer of the mecha for processing, finally transforming into the corresponding movements of the mecha. This was a simulation artifact that had become an antique. The plan for the simulator was aborted because after a long period of experimentation, the experts found a few problems that could never be solved. The first was the difficulty of data collection. The structure of the human body seemed simple, but in fact, it was more complicated than the most complicated machine. The corresponding changes in every human movement contained too much data. The degree of contraction of the double muscle fibers, the direction of the movement, blood pressure, and even the changes in the surface tension of the skin. These subtle changes had to be completely identified by the data acquisition microprocessor and successfully converted into the corresponding movement. Even with the help of the powerful computing power of the central control computer, the accuracy rate was always around 70%. On the fierce battlefield, the most important thing for mecha was accuracy and speed. If they could only guarantee this level of accuracy, then they were basically useless. The second problem of using the simulator occurred after the experimental simulator had been put into use. At that time, the pilots in charge of the experiment were all ace pilots of the military. Their movements were extremely precise, without the slightest bit of redundancy. They could control the trembling of their every muscle valiantly, thus increasing the accuracy rate of the mecha controlled by the simulator to more than 95%. But when they actually entered the actual combat practice, in less than 10 minutes, all the ace pilots had fainted from exhaustion. After that, they found that using the simulator to control the mecha required, on one hand, to ensure the accuracy and precision of the movements, on the other hand, to continuously perform the movements, which was really too taxing on the human body. Once these pilots entered the mecha and wanted the mecha to completely simulate their movements, they had to ensure that every inch of their skin and every muscle in their body was in a state of constant movement at all times. Before the experiment, the researchers had never paid attention to this problem because everyone had fallen into a misconception. They thought that the ace pilots of the military could endure extremely terrifying training, so naturally, this kind of taxing was nothing to them. However, the results of the experiment proved that if a pilot was asked to run 10 kilometers without a problem, but if he was asked to sit in a chair and constantly tighten his leg muscles, relax them, and tighten them again without actually running, after repeating this dozens of times, the accumulation of lactic acid in the muscle fibers would reach a very frightening level. This kind of load was not something that a normal person could bear. Before the simulator project was aborted, in fact, the military had secretly tried a more advanced control method, which was to capture the pilot's brainwaves and then analyze them through a computer to directly control the mecha. Unfortunately, this seemingly feasible plan failed miserably in the end. This was because the scholars discovered that they had once again underestimated the complexity of the human body, especially the complexity of the brain. The brainwave signals released by the human brain were too chaotic, and the effective information fragments could only account for 1% of the signal at most. If they wanted to successfully capture the effective information in the brainwaves, they would need a more powerful brainwave filter. However, after paying the price of more than 10 pilots' deaths or idiocy, there was no possibility of continuing this plan. Sulu silently stared at the continuous feedback of the data on the monitor screen. From time to time, he would jot down some key values on a piece of white paper beside him. A few hours had passed silently, and he had also been observing the state of transmission of the simulated bioelectric current in the B-section material for a few hours. While waiting for the data to come back, he would think of some things. In the Husk Institute's internal forum, he had once seen a post in the gossip section. The post said in a mysterious tone that the reason why the use of brainwaves to directly control mecha had failed was because the Bureau of Proclamation was unwilling to release the chip technology. At the end of the post, the author, who was obviously a high-ranking researcher of the Federation, lamented that within a few thousand years, there would be no other way for humans to use machines. They could only use the extremely unaesthetic manual operation. While reading the post, Sulu remained silent. This was because he had once seen a very strange method of control, one that did not belong to any currently known method. That was 1.5 years ago in the suburbs of Heshi region. He had been hiding in a large tree and had seen with his own eyes Uncle Fengyu, standing outside the mecha, but with those 10 trembling fingers, he had successfully seized control of the M52 mecha from the central control computer of the mecha. That scene had always been in his mind, never fading away. Afterwards, when he carefully recalled that scene, Su Li's attention remained on those trembling fingers. This was because within his own body, there was also this kind of trembling, surging, gushing power. Sulu needed to consider the existence of such a massive existence as a battleship. However, he had always been thinking, could it be that one day, he could also be like Uncle Fengyu, transferring that surge of power within his body into the cold metallic electrical elements? Like a stream of data, successfully controlling those unconscious component weapons? This was an extremely daring, even preposterous idea. The human body was made of flesh and blood. How could it possibly produce a stream of data that machines could identify? However, Sulu was increasingly convinced of this possibility, especially after he had fainted. The mysterious power within his body had already merged with his body, and his life had once again taken a fork in the road. Uncle Fengyu had once done it, and Sulu was currently researching and exploring it. If he could also succeed, this would definitely be a fundamental change in the way humans controlled machines. The temperature in the laboratory was extremely suitable, and the temperature and humidity in the dustless operation room were maintained at an extremely strict level. Sulu had been fully focused on his experiments for several hours, but there was still not a single drop of sweat on his forehead. The results of the experiments were not out of Su Li's expectations. The transmission of the simulated biological current within the wires was not too different from normal current. However, because the current itself was too weak, the loss rate appeared to be too high. Meanwhile, the B-type material wire was already the material with the lowest loss rate that could be found in the database. The problem before him was that the situation Su Lu had envisioned, using the microcurrent of the human body to control a mecha, or rather to control the chipset of a mecha, did not seem to have the slightest chance of success from these experiments. The weak current generated by the simulated current generator was already extremely similar to the spontaneous biological current of the human body. There should not be a problem with these materials, but the data collector at the end of the wire was unusually cold and firm in its summary. The electron stream did not produce any strange changes. In other words, it could not carry any data. Sulu had never hoped that he would be able to solve his biggest question in just one day's time and allow the mysterious power within his body to obtain the greatest benefits. He had even mentally prepared himself that perhaps he would never be able to come into contact with that magical world in this lifetime. Using the human body to directly control a mecha seemed to be a very simple proposition, but it was an extremely crazy idea. Su would not be discouraged by this temporary setback at all. In fact, he did not even see these experiment results as a setback at all. Su took off his goggles. His eyes that were exposed outside the mask were slightly tired. He opened the transparent door of the operation room, walked in front of the holographic screen table, and began to quickly browse through the data in the database again. Then, he fell into deep thought as he looked at a piece of historical data. Those previous experiments were just an attempt to confirm the doubts in his heart. Although he had failed, it made him even more determined to temporarily give up that crazy idea and switch to the idea of researching the antique simulation system, especially after seeing the research report on the flaws of the simulation system. He could not use the trembling in his body, for now, he would temporarily treat it as bioelectricity, to control a mecha. However, with his powerful mysterious power, he seemed to be able to use the simulation system that the Federation's scientists and military experts had already sentenced to death to directly control a mecha. In those mecha tests in Area H1, when he had fought against Zhou Yu's silver mecha, although Su had only used the antique simulation system in that final instant and had only been able to make a move for less than half a second, he had still succeeded. Unlike those ace mecha pilots who had conducted the experiments back then, when Su used the simulation system, the commands transmitted were transmitted through the trembling power within his body. The fine control of that power was far beyond the precision of human control over their own muscles. Furthermore, Su would not be like those predecessors who had collapsed from exhaustion due to exhaustion. This was because he used his mind to mobilize that mysterious power, not his nerves. Other than the fact that his stomach would become extremely hungry after using this power, there were no other problems. The fewer links there were to transmit commands between the human body and the mecha, the less exhaustion there would be, and the faster the mecha would be able to carry out the human's intentions. Su who could use the simulation system, undoubtedly had the potential to surpass the current level of machine control in the Federation and the Empire. Chapter 168. Su rubbed his eyes lightly and put in some eye drops. Ever since he was young, his goal was to become a top mech mechanic in the Federation, so he was especially protective of his eyes and hands. This had already become an instinct of his. When he stepped out of the laboratory door, the sun was already high up in the sky. It shone through the transparent heat shield of the dome of the Research Institute and fell on the people inside. Only then did he remember that it was time for lunch. In the long metallic corridor, people wearing all kinds of work clothes walked silently. There was very little communication between the staff of the Research Institute, and very little chatting. They seemed to be used to dividing themselves into groups according to their research groups and staying in their own laboratories to conduct research, like a nest of guinea pigs that were unwilling to come out of their holes. Even the coordination and technical support between the various departments was often done through email. This was exactly how Su imagined a research institute to be, but he also knew that there was no such thing as a pure land in human society. A research institute with a strong academic atmosphere was still a microcosm of this society. There were still political struggles and conflicts in this place, but these ugly things basically only happened in the upper echelons of the research institute and did not affect basic researchers like him. Su ate silently in the cafeteria, chewing carefully. He knew that he had to eat a little more now. Otherwise, once he activated that mysterious power in his body in the afternoon, he did not know how hungry he would be. The Research Institute and the First Military Academy shared an area, but the various facilities were strictly separated. In the cafeteria, which was a full 1,000 square meters, there were not many researchers eating. Su sat in the corner alone in silence. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that his colleagues who usually did not like to talk were much more lively at the table, especially those who belonged to the same research group. They were excitedly talking about something, as if there was an insurmountable problem in some important research project in the engineering department. The Shell Motor Company had a strong government and military background. The most independent and crucial department was naturally the R&D department. If the research center was said to be more focused on theoretical guidance and exploration of the frontiers of science, then the R&D department was more focused on practical R&D. The research results of the research center often required the technicians of the R&D department to transform them into actual objects. The battleships, mechas, even cars, yachts, and home appliances produced by the various subsidiaries of the Shell Motor Company were all designed by the R&D department. The people from the Research Institute naturally did not think much of the technicians from the engineering department. In their eyes, these fellows who only knew how to bury themselves in all kinds of tools were really too boring. They had completely forgotten the true purpose of scientific research, and at most, they could only be considered as employees of the Research Institute, but in the eyes of the engineering department, while those old professors in the Research Institute were worthy of respect, these assistant researchers wearing white coats had no right to be proud of them. They were all a bunch of boring fellows who only knew how to memorize theoretical formulas, and only knew how to boast, but did not even know the width of a mecha's track. They were even worse than the doctors who also wore white coats. Because of the difference in nature, the two R&D departments developed some sort of opposing sentiment. Whether it was the government of the Federation or the military, whether it was the company's board of directors or the technical director who was truly leading the way for the Shell Motor Company, none of them had any intention of trying to eliminate this opposing sentiment. In their eyes, this opposing sentiment was an extremely beneficial form of competition. It could promote the R&D standards of the Shell Motor Company and even the entire Federation to improve faster. The R&D department had a problem, so of course the people in the Research Institute were happy. Sulu smiled and did not continue to listen to this gossip. He lowered his head and continued eating. In the cafeteria, other than Sulu, the other researchers were all gathered together according to their research topics. This made his silhouette seem somewhat lonely and desolate. Sulu himself also noticed this point. He sighed softly in his heart. Whether it was at Donglin or at Yue University, his personality seemed to be unable to blend in with the crowd. It was rare for him to have a few true friends, but they were all shut down, left, and died. Could it be that he was destined to be alone forever? No one was willing to be Professor Shin's assistant. Although this old professor had a highly respected position in the academic world and was one of the rarest living Nebula Award winners in the Federation, the subject of quantum measurable dynamics was definitely not a promising one. It was enough to dampen the enthusiasm of all the researchers. In the quiet laboratory, other than Professor Shen, who usually stayed on the second floor in a daze from time to time, there was only Sulu and the static sound of the holographic screen on the table. This was also the source of Su Li's loneliness in the Research Institute. Today, Professor Shen was sick, so this laboratory was equivalent to Su Li's alone. He sat on the metal stairs leading to the office upstairs. He squinted his eyes and sized up the spacious laboratory. He subconsciously took out a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. At the same time, he turned on the dust removal system beside him. It was not unprecedented for a speck of dust to destroy a chip and then a battleship. Although this was a laboratory and not a manufacturing factory with extremely strict requirements, Sulu did not want all of his future experiments to come up with ridiculous results. The light green smoke filled his eyes and then quickly turned into a whirlpool in the air. It was absorbed by an invisible force, and the laboratory was clear again. Sulu held the cigarette between his lips. He squinted his eyes and enjoyed a rare moment of leisure. His eyes slowly and attentively scanned everything in the laboratory. With Professor Shin's qualifications, it was not surprising that he could have such a large and complex database. What Sulu was curious about was why his little assistant had access to such a high level of access. It was because of this access that he could find a lot of things he needed. What surprised him even more was that in this two-story laboratory, there were actually so many materials that were rarely seen. Some of these materials were polymer materials that he had only seen in academic journals when he was in Donglin district. In the large warehouse behind the building, there were all kinds of precision instruments and tools that Sulu was most familiar with and loved. Sulu frowned and stubbed out the cigarette. He could not understand why an old professor who was engaged in pure theoretical physics research would need these things. Since he could not understand, he stopped thinking about it. Anyway, Sulu knew that everything in this laboratory could help him accomplish a lot of things he wanted to do. It was like a big piece of pie falling from the sky and accurately hitting his head. The most oily edge of the chopped green onions was delivered right into his mouth. Was there anything more wonderful in the world than this? No. In the past, in this laboratory, Sulu was busy with the various tasks that Professor Shin gave him. He did not have the time or courage to do his own things. However, at this moment, the laboratory belonged to him alone. Of course, he had to seize this opportunity. After stuffing out the cigarette and confirming the time, Sulu took a few deep breaths and calmed down. He put his right hand on his left wrist and gently rubbed the metal bracelet that Uncle Shin gave him a few times. With a calm expression, he silently walked to the holographic screen table and began to examine the information he needed. From this information, he obtained the information he needed and found the appropriate materials in the warehouse to form the tools he needed. Mechanic Yu Feng, or Uncle Feng Yu, was the #1 wanted criminal in the Federation. In his eyes, Sulu was a mechanical genius, so Sulu was without a doubt a genius. Especially since there was no one watching over the laboratory today, he no longer had to worry about anything. The strange ideas in his mind, the rich practical experience he had over the years, and the systematic review of theoretical knowledge under the pressure of old Professor Shin these days, all blended together and began to emit light. Accompanied by the buzzing sound of the microcontrolled machine tool and the electronic etching needle in the warehouse behind the laboratory, it did not take long for Sulu to successfully assemble 4 simple-looking instruments. Although the appearance was ugly, if these 4 monitoring instruments were to appear in front of the experts of the Nutshell Engineering Department, they would definitely be amazed and shocked. They would use the most effective method to recruit the instrument maker. Because the circuits of these instruments were simple, the working principles were stable, and the ideas were unique. They had completely exceeded the conventional thinking of the average engineer. To put it simply, only a genius or an idiot's design, coupled with the creation of a top-notch engineering expert, could achieve such an effect. Perhaps this was not the most advanced, but in terms of concept, it was definitely the most original. And what the Federation engineers, who had been stuck in a dilemma for many years, needed the most now was a completely different way of thinking. Right at this moment, the door of the laboratory opened. Sulu walked to the door and signed for the instrument he had applied for. The main purpose of this instrument was similar to a signal collection system for mecha control simulators. The application he had just sent out via email before lunch had actually arrived so quickly. Only now did he truly understand that as long as he had the authority given to him by Professor Shen, at least a large portion of the Shell Motor Company's resources would be open to him. This was really an endless mountain of treasures that he did not immediately begin to test the strange power in his body. Instead, he first turned off the automatic recording program in the central control computer in the laboratory. Then, he narrowed his eyes and examined every corner of this spacious laboratory. In the end, he still felt uneasy. After a moment of hesitation, he fished out a palm-sized instrument from the pocket of his coat on the chair and lightly pressed a button. With the movement of Su Li's fingers, a faint blue light was emitted from the small tool. It was like the stars in the distant universe, without a trace of shaking. It calmly and solemnly enveloped his body, and gradually expanded until it enveloped the entire interior space of the laboratory. In the bracelet that Uncle Feng Yu had left him, there were no impressive blueprints, but there was an assembly diagram of the chip circuit of this small instrument. Until today, Sulu still did not know what principle this small instrument, which could temporarily isolate the glory of the Charter and cause the multi-layered electronic surveillance network of the Federation to fail, worked according to. However, this did not stop him from replicating such a tool a long time ago. As early as when he had been undergoing mecha training in Yue University's H1 area, Sulu had already made preparations for this. The isolation provided by the faint blue glow did not last long. Sulu did not immerse himself in his memories. Instead, he entered the operation room as quickly as possible and connected the 4 assembled instruments to the surface of his skin through a data cable. Finally, he connected the cable to the signal collector for the simulator he had just applied for. In the spacious and quiet laboratory, only the sound of electronic particles from the ventilation system and the dust removal system could be heard. In the transparent operation room, Su Lu, who was enveloped in a blue glow, closed his eyes. Then, his body began to tremble slightly. This trembling grew more and more intense, to the point that the data cable connected to his body was like a willow branch in the wind, swaying incessantly, ready to break at any moment. Chapter 169. Sparks flew everywhere, and the alarm lights flashed continuously in the control room. Thankfully, the smoke detector was not activated. Su Lu stared silently at the signal collector beside him, which had been destroyed by the electric current, and could not help but shake his head in frustration. He pulled out those data wires that were stuck to his bare skin, and the low-voltage resistance chips left some round marks on the surface of his skin. Right then, Su Lu had a rare moment of self-deprecation. He really did look like a spotted dog. He went to the operation room and put on a coat. He threw the pieces of wires and instruments that had been shattered into pieces by his own power into the waste disposal chamber. Then, he lowered his head and moved closer to the light screen. He began to carefully observe the data records of the 4 monitoring devices that he had previously assembled. Just as he had predicted before the experiment, the signal collector could not completely identify the mysterious power in his body. The data on the monitoring devices showed that there was only about a 20% success rate. And when Su Lu had finally increased the output of the power in his body, that signal collector had already been overloaded, and had been destroyed in a shower of electrical sparks. In Yue University's H1 section, during that mecha battle with Zhou Yu, Su Lu had used the mysterious power in his body in the end to operate his mecha directly through the simulation system. That was how he had managed to make that Black M prototype mecha display such incredible power in that instant. The experiment before his eyes proved that Su Lu could still only use that power to strengthen the movement of his own body, and could not directly use this power to operate the simulation system. How had he done it that day? Su Lu narrowed his eyes, and began to recall his practice in the library's H1 section, as well as that final battle where he had to walk away with his hands on his stomach. Gradually, the serious expression in his eyes relaxed, and he gave up on thinking. A success rate of at least 20% was already high enough. After all, this was his first experiment, and he had not used the real simulation system, just a backup signal collector. Su Lu knew that if he really wanted to use this never-before-seen method to operate mecha or other mechanical equipment in the future to obtain his own skills in the Human Federation Society, he would need to improve on 2 aspects simultaneously. On one hand, he would need to increase his proficiency in using the mysterious power in his body, and more importantly, he would need to understand how the simulation system could identify the power's workings through the trembling of his skin, and then improve on the simulation system. To truly achieve the unity of man and machine, that was an extremely difficult and distant matter. A temporary setback was nothing. Su Lu tilted his head slightly, looking at the data he had recorded. He thought to himself that right now, he needed a real simulation system to carry out the modifications, or, if he could have a real military mecha, that would be even better. Mecha control simulation systems had long been abandoned by the experts of the Federation. It had already been several decades since there had been a research project on this topic. However, those simulation systems left in the warehouse were still in good condition, and were sometimes even sold to mecha enthusiasts as part of their collections. Su Lu had once ordered a set of simulation equipment from the Shell Motor Company as a collector, and had personally used it. It could be said that he was one of the very few people in the Federation Society who was familiar with simulation systems. The problem was that research in this area had long been abandoned. If the Federation Research Department wanted to modify the original system now, they would already be missing a large portion of the engineering support. Furthermore, Su Lu was just one person. Even if he had an admirable talent in the field of machinery, this sort of modification idea still seemed a little far-fetched at the moment, like the ravings of a lunatic. However, he was confident, because other than the incredibly large database in this laboratory, as well as those Federation's most advanced equipment, there were also countless strange, but clearly very advanced blueprints in his mind. The way he saw it, these blueprints had been left to him by Uncle Feng Yu through the chip on the back of his neck. The powerful mysterious power within his body had also been left to him by Uncle Feng Yu. From very simple logic, he could deduce that there must be some knowledge on how to use this power to control mecha. Su Lu finished reading the data in silence, and then destroyed it all. This matter involved one of the 3 great secrets within his body. He did not want the Federation government to link him to Uncle Feng Yu. Right at this moment, a gentle beep suddenly sounded from the holographic screen outside the operations room. Su Lu was slightly taken aback. He buttoned up the buttons on his military uniform and walked out of the operations room. At this time, those small tools that could block out all electronic surveillance were no longer glowing with blue light, and he had put them away into his pocket. On the holographic screen was an email sent out by the head of the 3rd Division of the Research Institute. The markings on the email clearly showed that this email had been sent to every independent laboratory in the 3rd Division of the Research Institute, and its confidentiality level was S level. Su Lu read the contents of the email, and his eyes gradually narrowed. Just like the news he had heard in the cafeteria at noon, this email said that the new mecha recently developed by the Shell Motor Company Engineering Department had encountered some kind of problem, and required technical support from the Research Institute. The higher-ups of the Research Institute did not impose any rigid requirements on the various laboratories. They only listed a few problems that the engineering department had encountered in the email, and hoped that the researchers in the various laboratories would be able to provide some feasible ideas. Su Lu quickly finished reading this email and sank into deep thought. After entering the Husk Institute, he had signed a confidentiality agreement, so he was not worried that he would know too much that he should not know. On the contrary, he knew the background of this matter. The Shell Motor Company Engineering Department was currently developing a new mecha, temporarily named MX. Last autumn, this mecha had been successfully developed, but after that, during Whitewater Security Company's experimental use of the mecha, they seemed to have encountered some extremely difficult problems. The Shell Motor Company was a huge company. Other than its deep background in the government and the military, its industry was involved in every corner of the industry related to machinery. Just like the company's slogan, where there was metal, there would be shells. However, the most cutting-edge engineering research and development was still in the area of battleships and mechas. These highly refined engineering results could often be used for civilian use. However, these various types of machinery that came out of the laboratories and engineering departments, no matter how many times they had been tested under harsh laboratory conditions, had to be put into practical use in the end. Before they were fully formed, there had to be certain departments that specialized in conducting experiments on these new weapons and tools. The huge Shell Motor Company's various new weapons needed to be tested in actual combat. It was precisely for this purpose that the board of directors of the Shell Motor Company established the Whitewater Security Company, which was directly responsible to the board of directors and the Ministry of National Defense. The Shell Motor Company did not have the intention of generating profits for the Whitewater Company. For countless years, the latest results of the Shell Motor Company had been put into Whitewater Company's experiments, and in actual combat, they had discovered many problems that were difficult to discover in the laboratory. Although this security company did not have a high position within the Shell Motor Company, they had the most advanced weapons of the Federation, the technical support of the entire Shell Engineering Department, and the support of the Ministry of National Defense. Of course, the combat power they displayed was also very strong. In today's Federation, the Whitewater Security Company was on par with Black Hawk and Blue Bird. They received non-stop business, and their profits were gradually increasing. This made the Shell Motor Company's board of directors and shareholders who only knew how to collect dividends very happy. Su Li's gaze had long since moved away from the email. The latest model of the MX mecha developed by the engineering department had been exposed during an armed operation by the Whitewater Company at the edge of the Triangle Zone. This had directly led to the failure of this mission, which had angered the Ministry of National Defense and the Shell Motor Company's board of directors. The engineering department was under great pressure, so during the spring recruitment exam, the engineering department's human resources manager, Jose, had personally come to the scene to snatch people away. This was mainly to deal with the mecha's research and repair work. Sulu did not know much about the Whitewater Company, but he knew the predicament the engineering department was in now. He stared at the several block schematics downloaded onto the holographic desktop and narrowed his eyes slightly. After the experiment just now, he had been thinking that he needed a simulation system and a mecha. He did not expect the opportunity to come knocking on his door. From the email, it could be seen that as long as the laboratory staff of the research institute could come up with a solution, the engineering department would definitely invite that person over, and that person would definitely be able to have the most intimate contact with the mecha. This was an opportunity, and Sulu knew that he had to seize it. However, regarding the effects of the turbulent flow of electrons in the engine under conditions of 3 times gravity. Just looking at the long list of names, he knew that it was extremely tricky. How should he seize this opportunity? Give me strength, Chip. Sulu opened the schematics, and at the same time, began to quickly search through the strange schematics in his mind. The images of reality and illusion overlapped before his eyes, and then separated. Countless amounts of data and information began to flow rapidly in his mind. After a long time, the pale-faced Sulu closed his eyes. He finally found some vague information from the schematics in his mind. It seemed to be related to the problems the Nutshell Engineering Department had encountered when they were researching and developing the mecha. The schematics in his mind were not omnipotent. At least, they could not directly solve those problems. However, the meticulous design of those schematics and the genius of the idea had opened countless doors for Sulu. Comparing knowledge was the easiest way to find problems with each other. Sulu opened his eyes. They were calm, and he began to lower his head to re-examine the engine schematics sent over by the engineering department. There was still a long time before the deadline requested by the Nutshell Engineering Department. Sulu was in a hurry. Moreover, the design of the engine was too complicated. He did not have the confidence that he could solve this problem in one go just by relying on the strange schematics in his mind, especially regarding the turbulent flow of electrons. His expression was extremely serious. He carefully drew on the schematics with his digital pen. He was not too excited, because at this time, he finally confirmed that the schematics in his mind seemed to be more advanced than the most advanced designs of the Federation. Uncle Fengyu, how can you be so awesome? You don't know the passage of time when you're watching a game of chess, and you don't know the passage of time in the mountains. This was to say that when a person was fully focused on something, it was easy for problems to arise. When Sulu gently rubbed his reddened eyes and woke up from the endless schematics, he realized that his hunger had reached a terrifying level. He suddenly thought of something, and his expression changed slightly. He packed up everything in the laboratory and rushed out of the research institute as fast as he could. Just as he stepped out of the door, he was stunned to see Zhou. Chapter 170. The evening breeze was cool, but it couldn't wipe away the indifference and anger on Zhou's face. This unmarried mother was wearing a light floral dress with a pink shawl draped over her exposed shoulders. Under Su Li's instructions these days, Zhou seemed to be used to thinking about things as a mother, and she protected her body very well. Zhou's tone was still a little condescending, which was the kind of arrogance that Sulu found hard to accept. However, looking at the snow-white gauze on her cheek, Sulu was silent for a while, and the little bit of unhappiness in his mood disappeared with the wind. He said with a smile, "It's 9:30. Hearing his answer, Zhou, who had been accumulating anger for several hours, was stunned. Her delicate eyebrows slightly furrowed, and she said impatiently, "Why aren't you going to eat yet?" Sulu was slightly surprised. He took the bag in her hand, turned sideways, and asked, you didn't eat at home? The eldest daughter of the Zhou family lowered her head, showing a trace of shyness, and whispered, I don't know how to cook. Su Li's expression was calm, but in his heart, he was cursing Shi Qinghai, who had disappeared without a trace. He had a one-night stand, and in the end, he had to take care of such an idiotic pregnant woman. Last night, he took Zhou Yu to the hospital for bandaging, and at the same time, he made an appointment with the clinic for a pregnancy checkup today. Originally, Su Lu and Zhou Yu had agreed that he would rush home as soon as possible after work today, and then pick her up to take her to the hospital. However, he didn't expect that the laboratory would become his exclusive zone today. Those thoughts that had been hidden for a long time couldn't help but jump out. In the afternoon, he saw the email again. Su Lu was so immersed in the problem of the engineering department's advanced twin engines that he forgot the time for a while. Su Lu looked up at the sky, and saw that the 2 crescent moons had already risen from the horizon. He knew that it was very late, and the appointment with the hospital had already passed. This matter was indeed his fault. He laughed at himself, but then thought of another matter. He looked at Zhou Yu curiously and asked, Why are you here alone? I'm starving at home. In the past, Zhou Yu's facial features were deep and cold, but now her eyebrows were gradually soft and delicate. It was probably the effect of pregnancy. She said coldly, You don't care about me, of course, I have to find food. I can call for a taxi. I'm only thinking of one question. Lady Tai likes you so much to be her daughter-in-law. I always thought that after all these years, your family would at least let you practice your cooking skills. Su Lu carried his bag and held her arm as they walked to the parking lot. After Zhou Yu heard this, the expression on her face froze. After a moment, she sighed softly and didn't say anything. Instead, she covered her mouth with her hand and retched. Su Lu frowned slightly and gently patted her back. According to the information he had checked, after a month of pregnancy, the nausea would not be as strong. Why did Zhou Yu have such a strong pregnancy reaction? Zhou Yu angrily pushed his hand away. With some difficulty, she straightened up and said loudly, I'm hungry, not nausea. As soon as she said this, Su Lu immediately felt guilty. Pregnant women couldn't be hungry, and at this time, he also felt that his stomach was starting to panic. In the afternoon, he used the mysterious power in his body. Although he didn't use it much, after so long, it finally started to remind him with a strong sense of hunger. Let's go home quickly. I'll cook for you, Su Lu said naturally. No, it's rare for us to come to the city. Of course, we have to eat something good. Zhou Yu replied coldly. Zhou Yu had lived in Su Li's apartment in Wangdu for 20 days. Every day, other than walking in the community, she was resting on the sofa. Zhou Yu, who liked to wear red, couldn't stand these boring days. She often ridiculed Su Lu for living in the suburbs. At this time, the two of them were at the entrance of the first military academy, so of course, they were in the city. Su Lu was silent for a moment. In his heart, he also understood that it was not a good choice to let a pregnant woman stay at home, especially an unmarried mother like Zhou Yu, cut off all ties with her previous luxurious life. You pick a place. Su Lu felt for the bank card in the pocket of his military uniform and confirmed that it was on him. Lin Yuan, do you know how to get there? I don't know. I'll show you the way. Zhou Yu naturally sat in the passenger seat. She didn't expect that a commoner like Su Lu would know the gathering points of her social circle. However, when Su Lu carefully fastened her seatbelt and gently closed the heavy door, a touch of warmth quietly appeared in her cold and mocking eyes. Lin Yuan was not a garden, but a clubhouse. It was said that it was originally a guest house of the HTD Bureau's Forestry Department of the Federation. Later, because of poor management, it was bought by a tycoon named Lin. A black car without a logo slowly stopped in front of the clubhouse. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked through the large iron gate and the seemingly endless lawn behind the gate at the quiet courtyard shrouded in lights in the distance. He never would have thought that the place Zhou Yu chose would be so luxurious. Earlier on the road, he already knew the origin of Lin Yuan. However, when he saw the rare scenery of the forest in the city, his heart slightly moved and he had some more ideas. Just based on this oil painting, the business of the HTD Bureau's guest house couldn't have been bad. Everything in the world had a price, but the scenery was priceless. The tycoon named Lin could not have bought this place just because he had too much money. His identity and status were definitely not ordinary. What surprised him even more was that in the distance, under the night vision lights, there were a few protruding mountain peaks. The cliffs were white, and there was a trace of absolute beauty in the beauty. Earlier, there was actually a commercial plane that slowly landed under the contrast of these white peaks. This scene was really too shocking. It seemed that there was actually an airport behind Lin Yuan. Su Lu was a very ordinary person, but since escaping from the Donglin district, he had coincidentally met many big shots in the Federation. He had experienced interstellar travel and also sat in Tai Ziyuan's private jet. However, when he suddenly saw such a scene, he still found it hard to suppress his discomfort. At this time, the iron gate was already open. Under the respectful gaze of the service staff, the black car slowly drove along the hidden path in the lawn and into the depths. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the picturesque scenery outside the car window. He couldn't help but think of the Star Clubhouse in Linhai. Although it was also called a clubhouse like Lin Yuan, the difference was really too big. Tai Ziyuan and Zhou Yu were a match made in heaven by Lady Tai and Deputy Minister Zhou. However, Tai Ziyuan's trip to Lin Yuan was completed with Su Li's company, and Zhou Yu became a pregnant woman that Su Lu had to take care of for a long time. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but turn around and look at Zhou Yu beside him. He was slightly surprised to see that Zhou Yu's expression was a little strange at this time. She quietly looked at the scenery outside the window, but her hands were in front of her chest. Her slender fingers were tightly grasping the hem of the red shawl. She looked a little nervous. As the daughter of the Deputy Minister of National Defense and the future daughter-in-law of the Tai family, Su Lu obviously knew that she couldn't be like him, a country bumpkin, who couldn't adapt to the luxurious atmosphere of Lin Yuan, so he was a little strange. He lowered his voice and asked, "What's wrong?" Zhou Yu's face was a little pale. Her unpainted eyebrows were extremely delicate. She slightly frowned and said, "I suddenly thought of something." Su Lu didn't answer. He waited. "I'm pregnant." Zhou Yu's slightly pale face showed a touch of embarrassment and anger. She turned her head and stared fiercely at Su Lu. She said in an extremely cold voice, "How can I meet people like this?" Su Lu was slightly startled. He immediately understood what she was worried about. Every circle had its own way of life. He might not be able to understand it, but when a proud and cold girl in red returned to her former circle and suddenly became an unmarried mother, no matter which social class she was in, it was not something to be proud of. He narrowed his eyes and straightforwardly said, "Let's go back." Just as he was about to turn the steering wheel, Zhou Yu fell into silence. Her face gradually returned to normal. Immediately, a cold and ruthless light flashed through her eyes. She slowly said, "No need. I also understand that this matter can't be hidden from anyone forever. I just want to give birth to this child. It has nothing to do with you, and it has nothing to do with those people." Su Lu was silent. He didn't know why, but he suddenly found himself admiring the girl beside him more and more. Lin Yuan's hall was extremely spacious. The brightness of the lights in the hall was controlled very well. The diners could just look through the transparent floor-to-ceiling glass and admire the dreamlike scenery of mountains and rivers that was illuminated by the lights for who knows how many kilometers behind Lin Yuan. Through the glass, Su Lu looked at the lake and the white cliff on the other side of the lake. He sighed in his heart. Just the large searchlights that illuminated the mountain peaks cost a lot of money every night. That tycoon surnamed Lin was rich and overbearing, but he also had some guts in his heart. Zhou Yu stubbornly and proudly chose the most conspicuous seat in the hall. She silently sat across from Su Lu and elegantly and calmly took small bites of the exquisite food. The Tai family was definitely the most mysterious family in the Federation. However, Zhou Yu, who was used to wearing red, wouldn't deliberately keep a low profile. Especially after her father suddenly took over the position of Deputy Minister of National Defense at the end of the year, the relationship between the Zhou family and the mysterious Tai family was very clear in the eyes of some people. Those who could eat in Linyuan weren't ordinary people. They knew who the girl in red by the window was, but they didn't know who the young man in civilian military uniform sitting across from her was. At least, they weren't stupid enough to think that the young man was the crown prince of the Tai family. Therefore, they were very curious. When they saw Zhou Yu's slightly bulging stomach, they couldn't hide their shock. Fortunately, the guests who came in and out of Linyuan were all very shrewd people. They quickly wiped the shock from their faces. However, the scene was unavoidably awkward, so no one came up to greet Miss Zhou. Chapter 171. I hope you are not deliberately trying to embarrass your father. Su Lu lowered his head and cut the synthetic beef on his plate. I am not interested in playing with these things. Zhou Yu took a sip of red wine and looked at him with a complicated expression. I just want to make the pregnancy a real reality. My father is a very standard soldier. I can't rely on you or scratch my face to fight against him to the end. If the entire capital's special district knows that I am pregnant, maybe things will be easier. I don't want to talk about me anymore. Zhou Yu put down the wine glass and looked at him. She said softly, tell me about your days at the research institute. I am more curious about this. Why did you get off work so late today? Su Li's fork stopped on the porcelain plate. He thought about it silently for a while. He picked out the things that happened in the laboratory today that did not involve the confidentiality regulations and gave a simple explanation. Zhou Yu lowered her eyes slightly and suddenly said, I heard you say before that the Nutshell Engineering Department seemed to want to recruit you from the beginning, but you chose the Research Institute. If that is the case, why did you take this opportunity to go to the Engineering Department this time? If I go directly to the Engineering Department, I can only start from the bottom. I won't be able to touch the things I want to touch. If I can help the engineering department solve their current problems in the research institute, then I can at least make my requests in the engineering department in the future. Su Lu started his hand again and answered vaguely with his head lowered. Is it a mecha? Zhou Yu suddenly looked at him slyly. It's a secret. Su Lu didn't even raise his head. Zhou Yu looked at the boy in front of her thoughtfully and said, I've been with you for almost 20 days, and I've never seen anyone who cherishes their time more than you. Every night after washing the dishes, you study in your room until late at night. I don't understand. What exactly are you chasing? Or perhaps, what exactly do you want to do? Don't tell me it's because you want to stand out. If it's because of these things, with your relationship with Brother Crown Prince, the Tai family can pave a golden path for you at any time. Su Li's fingers stiffened. He never thought that Zhou Yu would ask such a direct question. After a moment of silence, he forked a piece of synthetic beef into his mouth and slowly chewed. His brows furrowed tighter and tighter. He drank a mouthful of water and raised his head to look at her seriously. The synthetic beef here is all wild beef. Su Lu said, I really hate the Wildlife Protection Act. I once went to the black market to buy meat. But the average citizen of the Federation can only use this method to secretly taste the meat. But this restaurant can openly sell it, and it even says on the menu that it's synthetic beef. This is your life. You take more resources, and you're always so hypocritical. Normal people will never know what methods you're using to encroach on their benefits. To be honest, I don't really understand these things, but I know you're doing it. Zhou Yu's expression gradually became serious. She carefully listened to Su Li's rare speech. Su Lu glanced at the men and women in the Linyuan restaurant. They were dressed in luxurious clothes and had extraordinary auras. He said with a trace of loneliness, the people of Donglin can imagine what kind of life the people of the capital ring lead. But the people of the middle and lower levels of the Federation will never know what kind of life people like you lead. A meal here is equivalent to half a year's worth of relief given by the Federation government to the people of Donglin. But you're still eating, Zhou said sharply. Yes, I feel like I can become one of you at any time now, and enjoy more wealth, resources, and status. Sulu lightly patted the military cap on the table, shook his head, and said, You just asked me what I want to do. Actually, I just want to make myself stronger. Stronger? Zhou did not understand this sentence, but she was very sensitive to the fact that the young man in front of her seemed to have some secrets in his heart. Why? I'm not Superman of justice, and it's impossible for me to change all the injustices in this society. But if such injustices befall me, or my family, or if I happen to see it, I really want to fight against such injustices. Sulu said with a serious attitude that she had never seen before, so first, I need to have the ability to fight against such injustices. Zhou looked at him quietly for a very long time. Ever since the conversation last night, she had developed a sense of respect for Sulu. She knew that this seemingly ordinary young man in front of her had a strong will. This strength did not refer to his willpower, but to his stubbornness in his heart. People like this in the Federation were almost extinct, so she believed that what Sulu said now was the truth. Perhaps, that kind of injustices has already happened. Zhou gently touched the gauze on her face. She looked at Sulu quietly and said, So you're making the best use of your time. Why do you need to make preparations? Sulu was silent. He knew that he had already said too much. As for his thoughts, no one in the Federation knew. He only opened his eyes wide to see the ups and downs of this society, to strengthen himself at all costs. If this society could not give him justice, then he would find it himself. Zhou did not pay attention to his silence. She looked at him with a strange gaze and suddenly said softly, Are you a follower of George Carlin? No, but I feel that the things he said are not wrong. You're always talking about people like us. I'm indeed not a good person, but I believe that in the class of vested interests, there will always be people who meet your moral standards. So what I'm targeting is not class, but fairness. The problem is that society is unfair to begin with. If you want to fight against this kind of unfairness, then you have to fight against society. And the power of one person will never be able to fight, unless you're that old man who lives by the lake. You're talking about the Lees of Philadelphia? Yes. Sulu smiled slightly. He thought to himself that in the entire history of the Federation, there was only one such military god who was able to rely on his own power to pilot a mecha and assassinate the Emperor of the Empire. Perhaps in the future history of the Federation, such a person would never appear again. However, he immediately thought of another languid and weathered figure. That uncle who wandered around the mecha like a demon, to Zhang Xiaomeng. Zhou raised her cup. Sulu, who had his head lowered, a glint of vigilance and surprise flashed through his eyes. He had never thought that this young miss from the Zhou family would actually be able to hit the nail on the head. Perhaps she was just guessing, but to be able to guess this point was already very impressive. He calmed his breathing, raised the cup of clear water, and said, To Shi Qinghai. Zhou's expression became somewhat unsightly. She paused for a moment, then suddenly opened her mouth to say, Can you tell me, what kind of person is that hooligan? Sulu was slightly taken aback. He quietly watched the trace of unerasable sadness on Zhou's delicate and beautiful face. He suddenly remembered that she and Shi Qinghai had only had a one-night stand. She had no idea what kind of person Shi Qinghai was, and perhaps, in the future of her life, she would never have any sort of relationship with the father of her child. From this perspective, the present Zhou was indeed worthy of pity. Sulu even thought that he had only wanted Mr. Shi to leave behind his bloodline in the Federation. Was this in itself unfair to Zhou? Mr. Shi is an orphan. You must know by now that he is a spy for the anti-government forces, the most outstanding kind. As for why he became a spy for the anti-government forces, it all started from the unfairness of the Federation. His father. After a moment of silence, Sulu began to explain everything about Shi Qinghai to Zhou Yu, from his birth, to his glorious achievements in the first military academy, and his work in the Linhai field office. Perhaps he wanted to make up for something to Zhou Yu, or perhaps he wanted her to have a clearer understanding of Shi Qinghai, so that she would no longer be a blurry shadow. Sulu was not as quiet as he usually was. He began to talk non-stop, and he presented everything he knew about Shi Qinghai in full, including his little tricks, his addiction to alcohol, his amazing capacity for alcohol, and the 27 glasses of wine he sang in a melancholy voice in the middle of the night after he got drunk. He combed his hair in a 37 parting and smoked 37 brand cigarettes. When he was drunk, he liked to say, "I'm not drinking wine, I'm drinking loneliness." Sulu was immersed in his memories with Mr. Shi. He subconsciously took out a cigarette, but then he remembered that there was a pregnant woman in front of him, so he put it back in the cigarette box. Disgusting to the extreme, Zhou Yu heard Su Li's words, frowned deeply, and said softly. She definitely did not like Shi Qinghai. On the snowy night after the Double Moon Festival dance party, it was only because of her complicated emotions that she fell into the irresistible eyes of that beautiful and bewitching man. However, as she listened to Su Li's description, the man who was so beautiful that he didn't look like a normal person, who was so affectionate in bed, gradually became clear in front of her eyes. Her right hand gently stroked the bulge on her abdomen, as if she could feel the growth of that little life. Zhou Yu lowered her eyes slightly and thought to herself, so your father is actually a guy with a pitiful background, but also a hooligan. Aside from his identity as an anti-government military spy, Shi Qinghai appeared to be very sincere in front of Sulu. The two men drank a lot. Although Mr. Shi could not get drunk, Sulu basically knew his friend's life very well, including what he did when he was young. That was why Sulu could say so much at this time. However, thinking about this, he couldn't help but feel slightly guilty. He knew Shi Qinghai's childhood and Shi Qinghai's secret, but Shi Qinghai didn't know his. There were not many VIPs eating in Linyuan restaurant. They were scattered everywhere in twos and threes, and there was a suitable distance between each table. However, eyes could ignore this distance. From the moment Sulu walked into the restaurant, he noticed that there were strange eyes around him. Although most of them looked away after a while, from time to time, he still felt that something was wrong. These eyes were all directed at Zhou Yu. Deputy Minister Zhou's daughter was pregnant, and there was a piece of gauze on her face. This made many people have countless imaginations. Sulu couldn't stop these eyes, and he was very impressed to find that Zhou Yu didn't seem to care about them. He just watched all of this with vigilance. Strangely enough, 20 days ago, Zhou Yu's abdomen was not very obvious. However, perhaps it was because Sulu had taken good care of her these days, and she had taken good care of herself in the apartment. The girl's lower abdomen had swelled up like a balloon. Now, she truly looked like a woman who was several months pregnant. Sulu put down the cup of water and turned his head. This was because he found that at the table that had been paying attention to him earlier, two young officers walked over, and he recognized one of them. Zhou Yu, long time no see. The young officer walking in front was about 25 or 26 years old. His facial features were deep, and his eyes were gloomy and calm. He casually stood in front of the table, but he gave off a different feeling. It was like the white cliffs behind Linyuan, leaving a deep and abrupt impression. A trace of apology appeared on his face as he continued, "I'm sorry about last time. I didn't know about your physical condition and had a drinking bet with you. I hope you don't mind. With my current physical condition, it's naturally not easy for me to stand up," Zhou Yu replied with a smile. After these few words, Sulu knew that this young officer with an extraordinary aura in front of him was the owner of the silver ghost that had raced with Zhou Yu on Highway 2 that day. He frowned slightly, not knowing why this person had come to his table. Zhou Yu had told him before that this person seemed to be a direct descendant of the Li family, one of the 7 great families. Su Li's memory was very good. He remembered that this person was called Li Xiaotong. Did this person know that he was the one who had driven the black car to intercept people that day? Looking at the sincere expression on the other person's face, which did not reveal any trace of mockery or hostility towards Zhou Yu, Su Lu could only wait and see. Unexpectedly, after Li Xiaotong and Zhou Yu finished greeting each other, he turned his head and politely extended his hand. Li Xiaotong, nice to meet you. Su Lu stood up and shook hands with the other person's extended hand. Su Lu. I've heard a lot about you. Li Xiaotong looked at Su Lu with a faint smile in his eyes and said, let's get together some other time. At this time, another young officer who came with Li Xiaotong also extended his hand to Su Lu. Su Lu looked at the blonde and handsome officer and said with a smile, hello. Park Ji-ho nodded and did not say anything. The one who drove the black car that night was this Su Lu. I've investigated this person. He's a very rare and interesting guy. Li Xiaotong and Park Ji-ho walked out of the Linyuan, followed by two subordinate officers. The smile on his face was very strange. When he saw Zhou Yu and Su Lu walk in, he had already sent his subordinates to the Linyuan parking lot to take a look. He did not expect to really find that black car without a logo. Park Ji-ho was slightly stunned. He did not expect that this noble young master would be interested in Su Lu and even sent someone to investigate him. Although Su Lu was in the limelight during the spring recruitment, Park Ji-ho did not think that a simple engineer could attract the attention of the second generation of the 7 great families. Guessing what his companion beside him was thinking, Li Xiaotong's lips curved into a slightly mocking smile. This second generation of the Li family did not have a good impression of the young master of the Tai family, who liked to pretend to be mysterious. However, this did not mean that the Li family did not value the only heir of the Tai family. The Li family had always used money to pave the way. The relationship between Su Lu and the young master of the Tai family, as well as this person's stunning performance in the Lin Hai incident, could not be hidden from the 7th young master of the Li family who had deliberately investigated him. That was why he said, I've heard so much about you. However, he did not plan to explain this to Park Ji-ho. He always thought that Park Ji-ho was a bit too confident. If this person was really stepped on by Su Lu in the future during the Lin Hai incident, perhaps it would be a kind of training for him. Who would have thought that Zhou Yu was actually pregnant? Li Xiaotong's eyebrows suddenly darkened at this moment. He had met Zhou Yu last year. At first, he did not care about the daughter of this kind of nouveau riche. However, when he heard that the Lady Tai saw Zhou Yu as her future daughter-in-law, he started to have some feelings for the red-clothed girl. In this world, the only thing that could not be touched was one's heart. Once it was touched, it could not be stopped. He actually started to like her, that was why he had raced and gambled. However, he did not expect that before he could do anything, the red-clothed girl had already become an unmarried mother. Even with his shrewdness, he could not help but feel a bit confused. After a moment of silence, Park Ji-ho said, with your personality, I did not expect that you would leave immediately. I like women, but I do not like to offend others for women. Our family is a business, so we have to be more careful. Park Ji-ho was silent. He thought that the Li family, one of the 7 major families in the Federation, would not be afraid of offending others. As if he had guessed what he was thinking, Li Xiaotong looked at him seriously and said, I also want to beat that Su Lu up, but I don't know what kind of position he has in the eyes of the young master of the Tai family. And I always feel that this person is not simple. Since I am not willing to take the risk to step on him, maybe I will not be able to step on him in the future. If that is the case, why should I offend him at this time? Park Ji-ho was silent again. He could not understand why the 7th young master of the Li family would be so wary of an engineer in a research institute. Li Xiaotong looked at him and did not explain anymore. In the future, he would be the support of the Li family in the military. If he still could not understand why he took the initiative to be friendly, then he was equivalent to a useless person. I am not my big brother. He seems to be a playboy, but in fact, he can be angry for a woman. Li Xiaotong closed his eyes and began to rest. He thought that if his big brother really got together with that national idol girl, it would not do him any good in the future. The little madman of the Li family is here. Park Ji-ho looked at the off-road car parked at the entrance of Linyuan and suddenly frowned. Li Xiaotong did not open his eyes and shook his head. He thought that if he did not know that Madman Li was coming, he would definitely sit at that table for a while. He wanted to see the real relationship between the young master of the Tai family, Zhou Yu, and that guy named Su Lu. At the very least, he wanted to know who the child in Zhou Yu's belly was. I can see that the young master of the Li family was not lying. Zhou Yu's eyes lit up. She looked at Su Lu and said, regarding the incident in Linhai, the madam, father, and brother did not tell me the details. I only know that the situation was very dangerous, and you happened to be there. Could it be that you played a very important role in it? Su Lu lowered his head and ate. He did not answer her. He used the power in his body in the afternoon, so he was very hungry now. The only thing that surprised him was that Li Xiaotong was so gentle. This was completely different from the mysterious image of the 7 great families in the Federation. The 7 great families in the Federation each occupy the most important areas in the society. They are very calculative, and their main area of control is the financial industry. Zhou Yu did not care about Su Li's silence. She gently stroked her belly and said, in terms of wealth, no one in the Federation has more than the Li family. I just did not expect that this young master of the Li family also has a position in the military. What does the Zhong family in the West Woods rely on? Su Lu suddenly asked. He had mixed feelings about the small watermelon family. On one hand, the uncle died under the main cannon of the ancient bell, but he did have a very close relationship with the small watermelon family. The military. Zhou Yu frowned and said, the 4th military region belongs to the Zhong family in the West Woods. It has been like this since before the constitutional era. There is an old saying, the high mountains are far away from the emperor. The West Woods region is too far away from the capital ring. Furthermore, the Zhong family's reputation in the West Woods is too high. It is so high that the scholars and experts can't understand it. In addition, in the past few decades, the threat of the dynasty has been too great. The head of the Zhong family led the warriors of the 4th military region to fight alone, which made the Zhong family's position more and more stable. What about the Tai family? Su Lu stopped eating and looked at Zhou Yu curiously. Not long ago, the 7 great families in the Federation were just legends to him. However, now that he could hear the true colors of these families, it was indeed very attractive. No one knows. Zhou Yu smiled. But I heard that the Crystal Mine Consortium used to belong to the Tai family. Later on, there was a shortage of resources. Su Lu was slightly stunned and fell into deep thought. Crystal mines were undoubtedly the lifeline of the Federation's development. The Tai family, the descendant of the former royal family, was indeed a terrifying existence to be able to completely control the Crystal Mine Consortium. However, with the decline of the East Woods region, there were fewer and fewer crystal mines that could be mined on the remaining 70 or so resource planets of the Federation. Presumably, the benefits in this area were not as good as before. Now that Tai Ziyuan was going to come out from behind the scenes, could it be related to this trend? Li Xiaotong is the 2nd heir of the Li family. Looking at Su Li's slightly heavy expression, Zhou Yu thought that he was worried about the previous scene. She lowered her head and said softly, although he has some bad habits, we can always get along well. He's not like his elder brother, who is recognized in the circle as the most beautiful man in the world, but has a heart that is colder and harder to corrupt than gold. Is that young master of the Li family more beautiful than Mr. Shi? Su Lu looked at Zhou Yu and asked in disbelief. Zhou Yu frowned, as if she was unwilling to compare that man with the young master of the Li family. After a while, she said hesitantly, more or less, but it feels different. I've only seen him once when I was having afternoon tea with Lady Tai. Su Lu thought that even if the Zhou family had a lot of power, it was far from being comparable to the 7 major families that could influence the Federation. The reason why she could calmly talk about the top figures of the Federation in Linyuan was probably because Lady Tai liked to take her out. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel a little nervous. Although he told Tai Ziyuan the inside story at the beginning of the incident, Zhou was the daughter-in-law chosen by that lady. If that lady misunderstood something, how should he explain it? That young Master Li seemed to be interested in you before, Su Lu said. You really have sharp eyes. Li Xiaotong probably thought that he could hide it from you. Zhou lowered her head and gently forked the vegetables on her plate. She said coldly, he's not the only one who has feelings for me. Su Lu believed that with Zhou's beauty, she could definitely attract many young men. Moreover, although her family started out late, her father was already the deputy minister of the Ministry of Defense. It wasn't strange for her to match the second generation of the 7 major families. What he didn't understand was that the people in that circle should know that Zhou was the daughter-in-law chosen by Lady Tai. Why would they still get close to her? My family background isn't worth mentioning in their eyes. The problem is that I'm the woman reserved by Brother Crown Prince. This kind of identity is, without a doubt, a great attraction to them. They can't find Brother Crown Prince, so they can only try to show off the feathers on their butts by pursuing me. Zhou's voice was a bit cold. There was a faint sorrow in her words. Even Su Lu felt a bit moved. I'm not that kind of person. Yuzi. I'm not that kind of person. A thunderous roar resounded throughout the dining hall of the Lin Yuan. Everyone's eardrums were slightly shaken by this sentence, and the floor-to-ceiling glass beside Su Li's table actually started to buzz and tremble along with this violent roar. Zhou immediately covered her ears. Her face was somewhat pale. Judging from the nimbleness of her movements, this definitely wasn't the first time that she had been attacked by this kind of sudden sound wave. An angry officer had appeared beside the table at some unknown time. It was unknown how long he had been listening, and it was also unknown why he was so angry. Su Lu looked in shock at this officer who had suddenly appeared beside the table. He immediately tightened his grip on the knife and fork in his hands and narrowed his eyes. Regardless of whether it was this person or that previous roar, they both made him feel an unprecedented sense of danger. Moreover, the other party had actually appeared beside him without him noticing at all. This was something that rarely happened ever since he began practicing with Uncle Feng Yu many years ago. This officer looked very strange. The reason why he was called strange was because his face was clearly still very young. Regardless of whether it was his facial features or his eyes, they all revealed that his true age wasn't very old. However, this officer who should still be a youth had an extremely sturdy and tall figure. The body hidden under the military uniform seemed to be full of endless strength and could burst this uniform at any time. A young face and a valiant body. This kind of intense contrast was extremely impactful. However, in Su Li's eyes, what was even more impactful was the golden flower on this young officer's shoulder. When did such a young lieutenant colonel appear in the Federation? At this time, Zhou finally put down her hands that were covering her ears. She looked at this young officer in shock. She never would have thought that he would actually be in the capital today, in Linyuan. Immediately after, she thought of another matter. Given this young man's temperament, Su Lu was probably going to suffer a calamity soon. To be honest, it wasn't just her. Even the important figures of the 7 great families felt a great headache when dealing with this young officer. This was because no matter who it was, if they encountered a madman who didn't follow the rules of the circle and had an astonishingly powerful backing, they would all feel incomparably troubled. Zhou. How did you get pregnant? The young officer's eyes widened as if he had seen the most inconceivable scene in the world. He stared at Zhou's bulging stomach, and his expression immediately became incomparably terrifying. He gritted his teeth and said word by word, "Is it Tai Ziyuan? Are you guys going to get married? If he dares to not want you, I will kill him." Madman Li. When Zhou heard this, she knew that the day was over. She was afraid that he would suddenly hurt someone. With a slightly pale face, she quickly said, "This matter has nothing to do with Brother Crown Prince." Chapter 172. A youthful face, an angry expression, and a body that hid endless power, all of this was concentrated on this young officer. When he had first shouted, he had referred to Zhou Yu as Yuzi, but after that, he had changed to Zhou Yu. Su Lu analyzed the situation at the table. He felt that this strange young officer always wanted to act mature in front of Zhou Yu. As soon as the three words "madmanly" entered his ears, Su Lu began to guess the identity of this person. To be able to become a lieutenant colonel of the federal military at such a young age, other than this person's own strength, his background in the military was undoubtedly very deep. A big shot with the surname Li in the federal military. His pupils contracted slightly, and he immediately understood why he had sensed such a strong sense of danger earlier. Unfortunately, before he could confirm the true identity of this young officer, the situation seemed to have turned to him. Madman Li was 16 years old this year. He had entered the army at the age of 12 and was the youngest officer in the Federation's history to be a field officer. As for how he was able to enter the military at his age, it was naturally because of the family behind him. No, it should be because those generals of the federal military who viewed his family as gods helped to cover it up. Nominally, he belonged to the 1st Military Region's Special Mecha Team, but in reality, he had been on the front lines of the confrontation between Planet S2 and the anti-government forces, as well as the front lines of the confrontation between the Westwoods region and the Imperial armies. He had only returned to the capital ring last autumn. A 12-year-old youth who had been on the front lines for 3.5 years with outstanding battle results, he was undoubtedly a freak. However, this youth surnamed Li was known as Madman Li in the capital's upper circles not because of his crazy life, but because this young officer never followed the rules set by the upper echelons of the Federation. He would not give face to anyone, and as long as he did not see eye to eye with something, he would throw a punch over it. A young officer who had sent a member of the Federation who was in charge of auditing the budget to the hospital could still appear so ostentatiously in the capital, in the Linyuan. This only proved that behind him was a glittering statue-level big shot. In the current Federation, no one dared to look down on him, not even the president. Madman Li, people were crazy, but their fists were even crazier. From the front lines to the capital, from the recruit camp to the parliament, and then to the nightclubs where the sons of the Federation's nobles frequented, he had fought his way here, and was actually invincible. The second-generation descendants in the capital who had suffered a loss, especially those from the 7 great families who were not afraid of this person's background, only found out later that this person had obtained the title of Invincible in the army at the Silan frontlines when he was 14 years old. After careful consideration, they could not help but sigh sadly. That old Li family had produced monsters after all, and no one had the luxury of using violence to regain their face anymore. Madman Li. No one dared to provoke him. Li Xiaotong, who had previously left the Linyuan, knew that this madman was coming, so he left early. He knew that this madman was like him, also interested in Zhou Yu. If Madman Li saw that Zhou Yu was pregnant, he would probably really go crazy. Facing Madman Li, the 7th young master of the Li family could only hide far away, afraid that he would be implicated by that terrifying feeling. Madman Li's slightly young eyes stared fixedly at Zhou Yu's bulging stomach. The anger on his face gradually receded, and he asked in a low voice, "If it's not Tai Ziyuan, then who is it?" Even though these words were said in a low voice, it still shook the eardrums of the people around him. They didn't know what kind of structure this young officer's chest was made of. It was like metal and stone. The expressions of the officers behind him were somewhat ugly. They vigilantly watched his hands hanging by the side of his military uniform, ready to go forward and stop him at any moment. They had received orders from their superiors to ensure that this young officer did not cause any more trouble in the capital. But at this moment, seeing the young officer's expression, they knew that this person was truly angry. And if they did not use weapons, how could they stop his anger? The relationship between the Tai family and Madman Li's family had always been good. Zhou Yu naturally knew what kind of terrifying strength this 16-year-old young officer had, as well as what kind of violent temperament he had. Madman Li's expression at this moment seemed calm, but she knew that this was the true source of the storm. This doesn't seem to have anything to do with you. Zhou Yu's heart was incomparably worried. Her face was slightly pale, but her tone was still calm as she retorted. According to the agreement she had with Su Lu, if there was no other choice, Su Lu could only pretend to be the father of the child in her womb. But at this moment, facing Madman Li's suppressed anger, Zhou Yu could not possibly push Su Lu in front of her. That would really cause someone to die. Madman Li might be crazy, but he was definitely not an idiot. For him to be able to live until now after joining the army at the age of 12 and still live so impudently, his brain was much better than the average person's. In just an instant, he had already noticed the worry in Zhou Yu's eyes. That worry seemed to be directed at the little man beside her. Since you are pregnant, there needs to be a man. Yuzi, although I haven't been to school for many days, but I still know this matter. Madman Li looked somewhat sadly at Zhou Yu, and then slowly turned his head. The sadness in his eyes turned into a domineering coldness as he stared at Su Li's face beside the table. Previously, he had not noticed this ordinary-looking young officer at all. A mere civilian second lieutenant, according to reason, could not have any relationship with Zhou Yu. He should just be an orderly sent by the Zhou family to Zhou Yu. Moreover, in the time he had been here, he had not felt anything strange about this ordinary second lieutenant. But, this second lieutenant was too calm. Madman Li's eyes narrowed slightly. Thinking of the trace of worry that had appeared in Zhou Yu's eyes earlier, an extremely cold light appeared in his narrowed eyes. His young and tender facial features, together with his cold expression, looked particularly frightening. If you are a man, shouldn't you say something at this time? After letting Zhou Yu into the car at the entrance of Qingshan Park, Su Lu knew that he would attract a lot of trouble because of this matter, but he was more concerned about the deputy minister, or perhaps the Major Zhou who loved his sister dearly. In the capital special region, the daughter of a minister who was pregnant out of wedlock would naturally attract a storm. Since Su Lu wanted to ensure that Zhou Yu and the child in her womb would be safe, under certain circumstances, of course, he would have to step forward bravely and take the blame. In Su Li's view, this was something he should do. He could not let Zhou Yu be pointed at in the back and guess who the father of the child was. Since he had let Zhou Yu give birth to the child, he had to bear some responsibility. I am Zhou Yu's boyfriend. Su Lu stood up. He did not say that the child in Zhou Yu's womb was his, but he thought that this sentence had already made his position clear. In the process of standing up, his right hand had stealthily reached for the edge of the table, which was only a very short distance away from the knife and fork beside the plate. His 10 toes in the military boots also began to slightly exert force, ready to grasp the ground and explode with a blow at any time. Nearly 2 years ago in the Donglin district, during the operation organized by the Bureau of Proclamation, Su Lu used the skills that Uncle Feng Yu had taught him for the first time. In the blink of an eye, he had knocked out a well-trained Federation Special Forces soldier. Later on the Ancient Bell, he had single-handedly defeated several outstanding officers from the Westwoods Military Academy. He had even exchanged a kick with the unfathomable Captain Tian. After coming to the capital ring, he had fought with the strongest ace pilot from the 1st Military Academy, Zhou Yu. In the underground parking lot of Linhai, he had wildly kicked past a cold military M52 mecha. In the dark splashes of water, under extremely difficult circumstances, he had killed those military experts who had tried to assassinate him one by one. Su Lu had not had many opportunities to fight in these past few years, but every time he had fought against the elites of the federal military, he had never truly lost, so he had enough confidence in himself in this aspect. However, at this time, he was so vigilant and careful. This was because from the moment before, he had felt a different kind of aura from this young officer in front of him. An extremely strong and terrifying aura. This was the most dangerous person Su Lu had ever encountered in his life. It was more dangerous than the countless times he had been pointed at by a gun barrel. He even suddenly thought that he would rather face that heavy and terrifying alloy mecha alone than face this young lieutenant colonel with tender facial features in front of him. The 16-year-old madman Lee was already very strong, very strong. Especially the murderous intent hidden under his calm expression at this time. It was like a monster lurking in the forest, causing people to naturally feel a sense of fear. Love and marriage are free. There's nothing wrong with getting pregnant before marriage. If anyone dares to say anything strange about Yuzi, I'll twist their head off. Madman Lee looked at Sulu seriously as if he was looking at a soldier under his command. It was just that this young officer was really too young, so the current scene felt a little strange. Within the strangeness, there was a chill of unknown origin. You're already so old, but you're still only a second lieutenant. You're doing very badly, but our old Lee family is not people who judge people by this kind of standard, so this is not a problem. Su Li's gaze lowered slightly. He thought to himself that he had entered the nutshell maneuver and been directly promoted to a civil service second lieutenant. Normally, this was already very good, but compared to a 16-year-old Federation lieutenant colonel, he was naturally doing very badly. He didn't understand why this young officer with terrifying strength would say these things. He only noticed that the other party's 16-year-old height was already half a head taller than him. That type of oppressive feeling seemed to have already become real along with these words. At this time, those officers who had followed Madman Lee into the Linyuan came forward, wanting to say a few words of advice. Unexpectedly, Madman Lee suddenly turned his head, glared at them, and roared loudly, "I'm explaining. All of you move out of my way." This was an officer his family had specially sent to keep an eye on him. Otherwise, he might have already kicked him over. In the entire universe, Madman Lee wasn't afraid of heaven or earth, not even his own father. However, there was always someone who was afraid of him. What was there to explain? Zhou Yu, whose face was slightly pale, didn't know. Su Lu, who stood silently in front of her, didn't know either. They only knew that Madman Lee's roar made the glass cup on the table begin to vibrate again. Madman Lee didn't pay any more attention to those officers who had no choice but to retreat. He looked coldly at Su Lu and said, "She is happy, everything is good, so I have no reason to hit you, but the problem is that I don't think she will be happy with you." His handsome eyebrows furrowed as he said, "Because you're not a man." When normal Federation youngsters reached Madman Lee's age, their brows furrowed because they were thinking about their little girlfriend or the difficulty of the levels in an online game. However, when Madman Lee's brows furrowed, the air in the Linyuan area seemed to suddenly become a bit hotter. "Because you're afraid of me, when I asked who the father of the child was, you didn't dare to stand up and admit at the first instant. This is very shameful, very unmanly, so you deserve to be hit. Yuzi is pregnant, so you should take good care of her. You actually dared to let her drink? So careless, you're not a man, you deserve to be hit. She wants to drink, but you don't dare to control her. You can't even control your pregnant girlfriend, what kind of man are you? You deserve to be hit. Your girlfriend drinks, but you actually fucking drink plain water. Of course you're not a man, of course you deserve to be hit." The young officer spat out a string of words. Quite a bit of his angry spittle landed on Su Li's face. The more he spoke, the angrier he became. However, even he himself didn't know if these explanations were for the sake of explaining to his family through the officers behind him, explaining to them why he had hit him, or just finding a reason to vent his anger. Su Lu stood silently and calmly in front of him. He wasn't distracted by these words. He only gently raised his hand and wiped his face. "You don't deserve Yuzi, so I want to beat you to death." After Madman Lee finished saying these words, his mood seemed to become much more relaxed. To the side, Zhou Yu's face had long become deathly pale. She knew that this little lunatic really dared to beat someone to death, and seeing the smile on his face at this time, she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to stop him. She picked up the wine cup on the table and splashed the red wine over. When Madman Lee said that he wanted to beat Su Lu to death, the last word had just left his mouth. While the tip of his tongue was still pressed against the gap between his teeth, his arm was raised without any warning and smashed down towards Su Li's head. It was hard to describe this strike, but it really did smash down. Just like that, it was sparse, ordinary, and impermanent. The young lieutenant colonel's right arm turned into a whip that could split open boulders, or a staff that could sweep away thousands of soldiers, and it smashed down calmly and resolutely. The distance between the two people was extremely close. Madman Li's arm under his military uniform arrived near Su Li's head with a whistling sound. If this strike landed, Su Li's head would definitely become a watermelon that fell from a high altitude to the ground. This was a very ordinary strike. Madman Li clearly didn't take Su Li seriously. However, when Su Li saw this vertical hook strike commonly used by the Federal Military Special Forces, his eyes narrowed. He felt an endless sense of danger. At the entrance of the nightclub, Hook had once used the same method to smash Su Li's head. At that time, Su Li's left hand blocked half of the force, borrowing the momentum to close in. But at this time, Su Li absolutely could not use this method. This was because from the sound of the wind carried by that iron-like arm, he was certain that if he still used this method, the fist of this young military officer in front of him would absolutely be able to make him lose his ability to fight in an instant. This was only a momentary intuition reaction. There wasn't even time to think. In this world, no one's reaction was faster than Su Li's. Without even thinking, the left hand that was wiping his face slid back along his cheek. Like lightning, he raised the tip of his elbow and bent his hand. His palm firmly protected the back of his head. Meanwhile, the upper arm that blocked the side of his head was like an iron bar, firmly protecting his temples and eyes. He only had time to make this move before Madman Li's arm had already arrived. This ordinary attack smashed fiercely into Su Li's arm. Meanwhile, the fist that followed the momentum and struck the back of his head solidly landed on the back of his hand. A muffled sound rang out. An extremely powerful and tyrannical force sank down along the area where the two arms made contact. With a ripping sound, the sleeve of Su Li's military uniform suddenly split open, revealing the skin below. Meanwhile, the back of his hand that was protecting the back of his head began to miserably fall off a few strands of hair. What terrifying strength! Su Li's upper body felt as if it had been struck by a huge rock. Although his upper arm and the back of his hand were like iron casting and blocked this smash, he couldn't withstand this huge force. His body tilted towards the side of the dining table. With a paw sound, Su Li's empty right hand supported himself on the thick wooden dining table. He didn't fall. Madman Li's eyes lit up. He didn't think that this seemingly ordinary second lieutenant girl would actually be able to block his first smash. His eyes stared fixedly at Su Li's right palm that was supporting himself on the dining table. A wave of numbing pain immediately spread through Su Li's arm. He didn't think that this Madman Li's strength would actually be even more terrifying than what he had previously estimated. However, the other party was only 16 years old. How did he obtain this kind of strength? The 5 fingers supporting himself on the dining table suddenly exerted force. His left arm was still protecting his head. Su Li's eyes already began to slightly light up. Such tyrannical strength aroused the hint of ruthlessness hidden deep within his bones. However, Madman Li didn't give him any chance to counterattack. Just as Su Li was about to exert force with his right palm, that extremely ordinary, yet extremely terrifying smashing fist once again smashed towards Su Li's head. There seemed to be no pause in between the 2 consecutive punches. It was like a high-speed rotating Darlin standard gun barrel, continuously spitting out 2 bullets at the fastest speed possible. The angle of Madman Li's smash was the same as before. The attack location didn't change, and it was extremely accurate and fast. Su Li simply didn't have time to react. His left arm that was still protecting his head forcefully blocked another heavy punch. Another heavy muffled sound rang out. He felt as if his arm bones were about to break. This young officer's strength was too inhuman. In terms of strength, Madman Li's 2 ordinary punches were more like cannonballs. The power of the second punch was even greater than the first. Su Li's heart became cold. Apart from Captain Tian of the ancient Bell ship, he had never encountered such a powerful character. The opponent's speed seemed to be even faster than his own by a bit. The knuckles of the palm supporting himself on the dining table turned white. Su Li's elbow was somewhat bent under the weight of this heavy force, as if it could collapse at any time. Right at this time, Madman Li's unreasonable and exceptionally terrifying third smash arrived in an instant. At this time, Su Li's body was somewhat unbalanced. His gaze was slightly lowered, and he simply didn't have the time to look at this punch. To be more precise, from the moment Madman Li's punch began, he didn't have the opportunity to raise his head. However, he had a pair of ears, and he was listening. He heard something strange. The third smash didn't carry the slightest trace of wind. Although Su Lu couldn't see it, Madman Li's expression had already become extremely grave. At this time, the military uniform on his forearm had already been torn into pieces. However, he could still feel an unprecedented sense of danger. Was it strength? Was it strength and speed so strong that even the deformation of the air would be slightly delayed? A scorching aura suddenly surged out from behind his waist, instantly transmitting to the first corner of his body. The trembling that had been successfully hidden under the skin began to spread to Su Li's arms. Madman Li's eyes had become unprecedentedly bright. The skin on his forearm that was exposed outside of the wound began to tremble. It was unknown whether it was because he was too excited, or because of some other reason. The mountain-like force pressed down, and Su Li's right elbow, which was propped up on the dining table, could no longer resist this huge force. He bent towards the table, and his forearm slammed hard on the table, making a strange sound. However, at this time, the trembling in his body already turned into incomparably tyrannical strength, supporting his body. He blasted back Madman Li's final fist. Meanwhile, his right forearm supported himself on the table, his entire body standing straight. At this moment, Su Lu finally saw clearly Madman Li's young face, his eyes carrying a crazed expression. However, his eyes were incomparably calm. It was because the instant he stood up, he already took a step in Madman Li's direction. A foot stepped between Madman Li's legs, a head smashing towards Madman Li's chin, while a thigh fiercely smashed towards Madman Li's crotch. This was the most ferocious of the 10 stances Uncle Feng Yu taught him. In past battles, Su Li's feet were like roots on the ground. As long as he bravely advanced, no matter who it was in front of him, they would fall under his continuous close combat techniques like broken trees and rotten branches. However, what was shocking was that when Su Lu took a step forward with lightning speed, his fist entering the middle, Madman Li also took a step forward. Moreover, just like Su Lu, it was purely a type of battle instinctive reaction. It was extremely natural. The two of them stepped forward at the same time, as if they were doing some kind of coordination. It appeared that harmonious. However, the harmonious two of them had already reached the most dangerous juncture. How could Su Lu, who had taken the risk of using the mysterious power within his body, let go of this opportunity? Even though Madman Li stepped forward just like before, preventing him from injuring the other's vital points, the left arm that had always been protecting his head and the right hand that shot up from the table like lightning already broke through the middle, directly striking towards Madman Li's throat. In this instant, Madman Li really went crazy. His young and tender face was abnormally pale, his eyes that didn't even have time to blink after the 3 punches were filled with a berserk intent. His left palm flipped over, directly sealing the front of his own throat. Meanwhile, his right hand, while carrying an intense trembling, directly struck towards Su Li's head. The young military officer was half a head taller than Su Lu, but he was actually prepared to use a single palm to block Su Li's 2 fists. It seemed like he believed in the strength of his own body, and even more so believed that his palm that could split mountains would be able to strike down the other party. At this moment, every single muscle fiber in Su Li's body was grinding against each other. The powerful strength made his eyes and ears exceptionally sharp, especially the speed of his reaction, which was already extremely fast. His left palm flipped over, directly meeting the palm that was striking towards his head. Meanwhile, his right arm followed the instincts of his body, following Uncle Feng Yu's teachings. At the final moment, the middle finger of his tightly clenched fist protruded slightly, and then he smashed down viciously. Two muffled slapping sounds rang out. Madman Li's palm fiercely struck Su Li's head, while the tip of Su Li's fist also struck a third of the area below his throat. However, under Madman Li's palm, there was Su Li's steel-like palm facing the sky. Under the tip of Su Li's fist, there was Madman Li's lightning-fast left wrist that blocked over. The two of them separated at the same time. The torn pieces of cloth on the sleeves of their military uniforms fluttered between the two of them, and then fell to the ground. Right at this moment, a cup of bright red wine was splashed onto Madman Li's face. This young expert, who was known to be invincible in the army on the West Wood's front lines, allowed the red wine to slowly slide down his tender face. He stared fixedly at Su Lu, who was not far in front of him, as if he couldn't understand no matter how he thought about it. For Su Lu and Madman Li, the previous 3 smashes and 1 exchange was an extremely long and dangerous struggle. However, this was only for people like them, who had extraordinary reaction speed. The customers in the Linyuan restaurant, who had different expressions, saw a completely different scene. They only saw Madman Li use a terrifying speed to smash the second lieutenant 3 times. Then, the two of them approached each other for a moment and then separated in the end. All of this happened in an extremely short amount of time. From the moment Madman Li began to move to the moment the two of them separated in the end, it was only a flash of time. The cup of red wine that Zhou had splashed out at that time danced in the air until the two of them finished fighting. Only then did it land coldly on Madman Li's face. Su Lu glanced at Madman Li and silently walked past him. He picked up Zhou's little bag from the seat, held her arm, and walked out of the Linyuan restaurant. Madman Li didn't seem to see his actions. He calmly stood by the table, not moving at all. He sank into a rare moment of introspection and contemplation after joining the army. He knew he had lost. In the end, the two of them had inexplicably used advanced body techniques at the same time according to their instincts. Then, they attacked at the same time. However, in the final moment, the second lieutenant's fist was lowered by 3 centimeters. It was precisely this 3 centimeters that made the fist leave the base of his palm, which had the strongest defensive ability, and land on his wrist. That wave of power that was even more tyrannical than his own broke through his defense and injured him. Madman Li took a deep breath and calmly looked at the empty table in front of him. He looked at the leftovers, knives, and forks on the spotlessly white tablecloth. In the beginning, he only wanted to vent his anger. He didn't want to beat the second lieutenant to death at all. Putting aside the strict control his family put on him after punching the counselor, just because the second lieutenant was the father of Yuzi's child, he couldn't really beat him to death. However, when his first fist smashed out, only to be blocked by the second lieutenant, Madman Li knew that he couldn't hold back today. Just like how Su Lu felt, this 16-year-old young officer also felt an unprecedented sense of danger from the other party's iron-cast upper arm. The reason why Madman Li was even more vigilant and used all of his strength was because Su Li's hand was propped up on the table. At that time, Su Li's 5 fingers were slightly curled, as if he could grab the table knife at his side at any time. Under his powerful attacks, he was still thinking about counterattacking, moreover already preparing a plan beforehand. Just how calm and terrifying of an opponent was this? He couldn't give that second lieutenant the slightest chance to catch his breath. This was the first time Madman Li felt danger in a one-on-one battle. That was why his second fist was even faster and more ferocious than the first. Meanwhile, that second lieutenant actually blocked it again, further deepening Madman Li's vigilance, also successfully stirring up his surging fighting intent. For the third fist, Madman Li already used a strange technique that was strictly forbidden at home, but that second lieutenant still blocked it. Moreover, the speed of the other party's counterattack was even faster than his own. His counterattack technique was even more incisive than his own. The other party seemed to know how he would respond, breaking through his attacks in such a natural manner, successfully striking the only vital point in his stance. Mad Manly lost, but he didn't feel any sense of defeat, only excitement and curiosity. He believed that there would be a day when he would fight against that strange second lieutenant again. He quietly stared at the dining table in front of him. Suddenly, the dining table collapsed. The sound of cold air being sucked in came from Linyuan restaurant. Apart from Su Lu and Mad Manly, no one could understand the true meaning of their exchange, especially that final fist and that final simultaneous attack. For the customers in Linyuan, they didn't believe that Second Lieutenant was Mad Man Li's opponent at all. They only thought that Mad Man Li was hurt by the matter of Zhou Yu and was troubled by love. In the end, he casually threw out 3 punches to vent his anger, sparing that second lieutenant. Naturally, they didn't understand that this incomparably sturdy dining table had long collapsed from the inside after bearing the dual power of Mad Manly and Su Lu. Mad Manly didn't eat. He led a few officers out of Linyuan. Only when they got into that extraordinarily large off-road vehicle did he break the silence and say, "Go to the general hospital." The officers following him didn't understand the meaning of the previous battle at all. However, when they heard their superior's extremely hoarse voice, they couldn't help but jump in fright. Mad Manly tightly closed his mouth, not letting a single drop of blood gush out from his throat. He felt as if there was a knife in his throat at this moment. Mad Manly wasn't afraid of pain, but he didn't want to die, and he didn't want his voice to become like this. After forcefully swallowing a mouthful of blood, he angrily cursed at his subordinates in a hoarse voice, "I'm not a real fucking crazy person. If I don't go to the hospital for surgery, do you want me to change my voice again and then die in the car?" A black car without a logo drove on the quiet streets of the capital special district. The pale-faced Su Lu closed his eyes and sat in the front passenger seat. He didn't speak for a long time. "Don't die." Zhou Yu's expression was bleak and cold. She felt apologetic in her heart. Her pregnancy originally had nothing to do with Su Lu, but this young man had to bear so much unreasonable harm because of her. "I'm not going to die." Su Lu opened his eyes and forced a smile at Zhou Yu. His smile was still as bright as the sun, but his exposed teeth were stained with blood. He blocked that palm, but the powerful shock still traveled to his head. It shook his gums a bit, and his gums began to bleed. "You're the only child of the Lees of Philadelphia, right?" he asked softly. "Yes." Su Lu narrowed his eyes. He recalled the familiar yet somewhat different trembling feeling that came from Mad Man Li's body at the last moment. His mood became a bit strange. Today, he had exposed the greatest secret of his body. He didn't know if that young officer named Mad Manly discovered it or not. After all, it had only been a month since it merged into his body. Mad Manly was indeed the most terrifying person he had encountered in his life. The battle in Linyuan was extremely dangerous. Those 3 consecutive thunder-like fists were truly hair-raising. Moreover, he could feel that the young officer really did have boundless killing intent in the end. If Su Lu didn't have the most powerful strength in the world, he wouldn't have been able to block it at all. Even so, in the end, there was still almost a problem. However, what was even more hair-raising was, could it be that Uncle Feng Yu was related to the Lees of Philadelphia? Chapter 173. Mad Manly, who was known to be invincible in the military, was secretly admitted to the Army General Hospital that night. Of course, he was using a nickname. This 16-year-old military officer had never suffered any setbacks in his life. Whether it was because of his youthful vigor or his arrogance, he was not willing to let this embarrassing news spread throughout the world. The fight between the 2 people in Linyuan was actually extremely dangerous. In that kind of situation, whoever held back would only end up dead. In the end, both of them survived. Nothing serious happened. It was purely a matter of luck. Su Lu and Madman Li's 3 hits and 1 burst was extremely violent. In the last moment, because of a strange feeling of harmony, their limbs collided and the 2 people were knocked away. Both Su Lu and Madman Li knew that if the situation at that time had been changed to any other situation, one of them would have probably left on the spot to deal with the aftermath. Because of the commotion in the Lin garden, the news of Deputy Minister Zhou's daughter being pregnant before marriage spread like wildfire. It was as if the news had wings attached to it, and it instantly spread throughout the upper class of Beijing. While people were shocked, they also couldn't help but have a bit of rumination. They wondered how Deputy Minister Zhou was going to deal with this matter, and whether or not the always low-key and mysterious Tai family would tolerate this kind of humiliation. Most people had forgotten about the existence of the young civilian second lieutenant. In the eyes of the upper echelons of society, this second lieutenant was only the trigger point of the incident. There wasn't much that was worth paying attention to. There were many people who didn't have foresight, but not everyone didn't notice the conflict between Madman Li and the civilian second lieutenant. The boss behind Lin Yuan, Lin Banshan, was naturally someone who knew how to judge goods. While he was out of town, after seeing the surveillance video of that day through the internet, he just smiled and said, "I didn't expect Madman Li to be at a disadvantage in a fight." That's really surprising. What kind of person was Lin Banshan? He was the most famous wastrel among the 7 major families in the Federation. His pair of eyes that specialized in examining aesthetics in the starry sky had long been recognized by everyone. This comment spread back to the capital a few days later, and it couldn't help but cause many people to look back at Lin Yuan that night. People began to pay attention to the civilian first lieutenant. Although a few forces knew his name through investigation, this first lieutenant was still a nameless person. However, it was possible that he could become the future son-in-law of Deputy Minister Zhou, steal the future concubine of the Tai family's son, and fight to a draw with the crazy Lees of Philadelphia. No matter how nameless he would eventually become famous. The upper echelons of society in the Federation consisted of the 7 major families, politicians, and professional soldiers. They looked at the law with contempt, avoided the Constitution, and controlled the majority of human society's resources and information. This circle was the ruler of society. For tens of thousands of years after the beginning of the constitutional era, the entire Federation society was under this kind of control. This situation had been stable for tens of thousands of years. The civilian second lieutenant named Su Lu was like a small stone that suddenly broke into a bagel. It was a bit abrupt and a bit conspicuous. However, at this time, Su Lu was still only a topic that the upper echelons of society would occasionally talk about after a meal. Over the countless years, who knew how many outstanding talents had appeared among the citizens of the Federation? These outstanding figures who had climbed up from the bottom of society would in the end throw themselves into the circle they belonged to, be accepted, and then assimilated, becoming a part of this circle. In the eyes of the upper echelons of society that controlled the Federation, if Su Lu could really marry Zhou Yu, then he would naturally also enter this circle in the future. Even so, this was only one of countless examples. Naturally, they didn't need to pay too much attention to it. They didn't know the true relationship between Su Lu and Zhou Yu at all. Those truly important figures wouldn't care about what happened in Linyuan. At the very least, the powers in the Federation's upper echelons who supported Jingzhou Governor Ross and Senator Macklin didn't pay attention to him, even though Su Li's name had already begun to appear in a lot of information. If one day, Su Lu displayed abilities that were worth paying attention to, based on his relationship with the Tai family and the Zhou family, perhaps the huge power that was lurking in the shadows would begin to suppress him. However, to those important figures, the scene in Linyuan was just a boring competition between young people who had eaten too much. No matter how amazing Su Li's combat power was, it wouldn't change their calm emotions at all. After all, he wasn't Madman Li. Behind the crazy power, there was a family and a god behind him, Feicheng, by the side of the calm lake, in front of the snow mountain. A middle-aged man wearing glasses and a black retro double-breasted suit was chatting with an old man. Some inauspicious light brown spots had begun to grow on the old man's face. Every time he saw these spots, the middle-aged man's mood would become a little lower. No matter how strong a human was, no, it should be said that he was the strongest human in the Federation, in the face of time, he would still appear so weak. He was a major general in the Federation. However, when he was at home, he never wore a military uniform. This was because this was his father's rule. Ever since the end of the war with the Empire more than 10 years ago, his father had personally sealed up the marshal's uniform. After that, he never wore a military uniform again. Instead, he always wore a rather ancient long gown. How are Mu Zi's results? The highest rank in the Federation's military was a general. Other than during wartime, the president would wear the title of marshal in the name of the commander-in-chief of the three armed forces. Since the 37th constitutional calendar, the only exception was this old man. During the First War between the Federation and the Empire, this old man, with the fanatical support of hundreds of millions of Federation citizens, relied on his amazing achievements and was conferred the title of Marshal by the Management Committee of the Federation. The president's term of office was once every 5 years. He could only be re-elected once. However, this old man's position in the hearts of the Federation's citizens would never diminish. In a certain sense, this old man wearing a long gown was the true number one person in the Federation. However, this military god of the Federation, at this moment, spoke with the tone of an ordinary old man. He was extremely similar to an ancestor who longed for familial love. Mu Zi's results after entering Academy 1's command department are already very good. During this half-year, he didn't fall behind in his studies either, Major General Li replied with a smile. I'm only worried that the child is too famous. His life in the academy will be a bit troublesome, the old man said with a smile. Major General Li also smiled. That unknown niece of his was probably one of the few people in the entire Federation whose fame could be mentioned in the same breath as his father. He suddenly thought of something. In a low voice, he said, Li Feng is still kneeling in front of the manor's entrance. When will you let him in? That's your precious son. I can only control my son, but not him. The old man closed his eyes. Through the empty wall of the courtyard, he felt the slightly cold wind blowing from the surface of the lake. He calmly said, as a soldier, he didn't listen to the orders of his superiors. Even if it is later proven that his choice at that time was correct, this kind of attitude still cannot be forgiven. Major General Li was silent. He knew that his father was blaming him for being too arrogant in disciplining his son. However, Li Feng had been thrown into the army by his father when he was 12 years old. For the past 4 years, he had lived such a crazy life. As a father, he felt boundless guilt toward his own son. Naturally, he couldn't bear to be too strict. What do you mean by invincible in the army? There are many hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the Federation. Who knows how many masters in the body cultivation hall? This time, he was beaten so badly that he couldn't speak. Only then did he know that the military pot was made of iron. The old man slowly opened his eyes. This is also a lesson for him. Otherwise, if he continues to be so arrogant, he won't have a good time at the front line of the West Woods. Major General Li was silent. He was very clear about his son's terrifying strength. In the federal military, there were few people who could be his opponent. However, since his father said so, he certainly didn't dare to refute. It was only when he heard the words, front line of the West Woods, that his expression became a little more serious. Whether it was Commander Zhong or that fatty Tian, when they saw Madman Li, they would probably have the urge to go up and beat him up. Sulu didn't know who would be alarmed by his fight with Madman Li in the Linyuan restaurant, but this didn't affect his clear-headed judgment. Perhaps without him knowing, he had already entered a certain circle. His identity as a fugitive from the Federation didn't worry him much. It had been almost 2 years, and neither the Tai family nor the Shell Motor Company had found out his true identity. It seemed that after the central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation confirmed it, there were no forces or geniuses that connected him, a second lieutenant, to an unknown orphan in the East Woods area. The only thing that worried him was that he wasn't sure if Mad Manly had detected the power he used. Mad Manly was able to obtain the title of Invincible in the army, and the strength he displayed in the Linyuan restaurant was indeed exceptionally terrifying. Under these circumstances, he, who wasn't at a disadvantage, should have attracted some people's attention. The Lees of Philadelphia. Could his secret be hidden from the eyes of the Federation's god of war? Besides, Sulu always had a vague feeling that Uncle Feng Yu might have an unclear relationship with the Lees of Philadelphia. Because of this vigilance, after returning from the Linyuan restaurant that night, Sulu started to get busy. From the utility room in the apartment, he took out a lot of standard wires and some common equipment that he ordered online, and started to assemble and decorate as fast as he could. Sitting on the sofa, Zoyu thoughtfully looked at Sulu, who was busy. She didn't know what this guy was busy with outside the apartment building. The weather in the late spring was finally hot, and Sulu couldn't stay at home to be exposed to the cold air. Sweating profusely, he simply took off his coat. Zoyu looked at his well-proportioned body and exposed muscles, and her beautiful nose twitched slightly. It's just well-proportioned, that's all. How can this body contain so much strength? He can actually fight to a draw with Mad Manly? Zoyu was puzzled. At the entrance of the Linhai nightclub, she already knew that Sulu was very good at fighting and could fight to a draw with Hook, a former Special Forces soldier. But what kind of person was Mad Manly? The only heir of the Lees of Philadelphia, the crazy young military officer who had never met a worthy opponent. What are you busy with? At this time, Sulu broke open the wires in the walls of the apartment. With a serious expression, he broke open the tricolored wires and began to connect to the data wires and equipment in the apartment. Zoyu finally couldn't hold back her curiosity and asked. Sulu didn't answer her for the time being. Only when all the data wires were gathered into a device by his bed and the final data was corrected did he relax slightly and explain, I installed some surveillance equipment around the perimeter of the apartment. Zoyu's eyebrows furrowed. She didn't understand the meaning of Suli's words. Could it be that this guy was worried that his father or brother would mobilize the military to arrest him? Not to mention that in the complicated political environment in the capital, would his father or brother be stupid enough to use military force to resolve family matters? Even if this really happened, could it be that Sulu wanted to rely on these abnormally crude surveillance equipment to discover the whereabouts of the military in advance? She couldn't help but laugh slightly. At this time, Suli's back was facing her, so he naturally didn't see her expression. He seriously pulled out an extremely thin holographic screen from the device and looked at the different colored dots on the holographic screen. He lightly sighed. This was the equipment that Shi Qinghai gave him before he left. When he was escaping from the Federation Investigation Bureau's pursuit in Linhai State, this set of surveillance equipment played a very important role. The range of the surveillance was about 500 meters around the apartment building. The main principle was to obtain the power of the Federal Military or Investigation Bureau's communication device and then distinguish it. Sulu used the materials he ordered online to supplement the periphery of this set of equipment. It should be able to barely achieve the effect that Shi Qinghai used it before. He turned his head and looked at Zoyu. He suddenly became silent for a moment because he wasn't worried about the Zhou family, but the Lees of Philadelphia and the entire Federation. The original purpose of living with Zoyu was to ensure the safety of her and the child in her belly. However, because of the Linyuan incident, Sulu fell into a state of vigilance. He realized that Zoyu wasn't very safe with him. These 2 days, there hasn't been any reaction from your family. After a moment of silence, Sulu said, it seems that your brother is very frightened by your actions. According to the Federation's law, the fetus after 6 months has the corresponding human rights. I think, after a while, your family will be forced to accept this fact. When that time comes, you should go home, right? Zoyu's eyes lit up, but it was the kind of cold light that reflected the light of the 2 moons like ice. She quietly stared at Suli's face, and a cold smile gradually appeared on her face. She opened her mouth and said, What? It hasn't even been a month, and you can't take it anymore? Su-lo knew that she misunderstood something. He lowered his head and explained, "It's my problem. I'm worried that you won't be safe with me." Shi Qinghai was the only person in the world who could see at first glance that Su-lo was hiding a heavy secret under his sunny face. It was very obvious that the mother of his unborn child didn't have this ability. But seeing Su-li's abnormal behavior today, as well as these words, and then thinking about the tenacity and calmness that Su-li had displayed these past few days, Zhou finally discovered a trace of a problem. "You have a secret, and it has to do with Mad Manly." Zhou gently supported her bulging belly and slowly stood up. She calmly looked at him and said, "You're ready to run away at any time." Su-li was silent, not knowing how to answer her. "No wonder even Mad Manly couldn't smash you to death. It seems that I still underestimated you. I always thought that in the future you would shine brightly in the Federation, but I didn't expect that you've been hiding your strength all this time. Everyone has their own secrets. I just realized that being with me won't make you safer." Su-li sincerely advised. Zhou quietly looked at him. After a long time, she suddenly opened her mouth and said, "It's very late. I'm going to sleep." After saying this, Zhou took off the towel wrapped around her head, threw it on the sofa, and walked to her bedroom without looking back. It wasn't until she closed the bedroom door and sat on the bed that Zhou felt a trace of disbelief about her previous performance. She looked at herself in the mirror without makeup and slightly frowned. She was becoming more and more accustomed to her face without makeup. Although when she had afternoon tea with Lady Tai, she only wore light makeup, but how many years had it been since her face was so clean? Just as Su-li said, with the heroic spirit Zhou had displayed in the tea house that day, whether it was Zhou or that big shot from the Ministry of Defense, there was nothing they could do. They could only watch as Zhou gave birth to the child. However, Zhou didn't want to leave this simple apartment. She quietly looked at herself in the mirror, becoming more and more beautiful. She thought to herself that staying in this apartment to block trouble for Su-li was not something she would do in the past. When did she become a good girl who was willing to be considerate of irrelevant people? Was it because of the child in her arms, or was it because that guy washed her hair? Perhaps she was just used to this kind of peaceful environment where she didn't have to worry about anything. Outside the bedroom door, Su-li stared blankly at the closed door. Although Zhou didn't say anything, from her previous words and actions, she definitely wouldn't leave. He very sensitively guessed the thoughts of this unmarried mother. Zhou didn't know what his trouble was, but she knew that as the daughter of the Deputy Minister of Defense and a girl who had a good relationship with Lady Tai, any trouble in the Federation would always be more powerless when she was with Su-li. He walked into the bathroom and happily took a cold shower. Wearing a bath towel, he walked in front of the mirror and began to carefully shave. He began to more carefully shave the fine hairs between his eyebrows. He gently stroked the cold metal bracelet on his wrist and confirmed the location of the new stun baton. He raised his head and looked at his knife-like eyebrows in the mirror. He was silent for a long time. Zhou had changed. In the mirror, Su-li smiled happily, giving birth to a trace of warmth and happiness. The next few days were the complete opposite of Su-li's vigilance. It was as calm and peaceful as usual. It was as if the battle with Mad Manly in Linyuan didn't have any negative effects at all. Every morning, Su-li made breakfast and wrote a note to remind Zhou where the microwave food in the freezer was stored. Then, he drove the unmarked black car through Highway 2, past Hawking Avenue and the Ministry of Finance, and drove towards the First Military Academy. Professor Shen was still in the hospital. He didn't know what illness he had. With this old professor's age, it was probably a sad time for him to be plagued with hundreds of illnesses. Sometimes, Su-li thought that as Professor Shen's only research assistant, he should go to the hospital to visit. However, he didn't have Professor Shen's contact information, and the officials at the Research Institute didn't reply to his emails. After finishing a day of work at the Research Institute, Su-li drove the black car back to his simple apartment in Wangdu. He started to cook dinner, prepare the ingredients for tomorrow's lunch, do the housework, and search for the things and information he needed on the civilian internet. Sometimes, he even washed Zhou hair. Her smooth, black hair twirled between his steady, slender fingers. Now, he and Zhou would occasionally chat, and the atmosphere between the two of them was getting better and better. However, after Zhou asked Shi Qinghai for the nth time about interesting childhood stories, Su Lu suddenly realized that he couldn't find anything new to talk about. Or rather, between the two of them, they didn't need to talk too much in the first place. Life passed by just like that, day after day. It seemed normal and boring, but in reality, it was peaceful and quiet. In this peaceful life, the only thing that made Su Lu feel excited was that now, in the laboratory that was exclusively for him, he could finally fully display his mechanical talents. His research on the signal acquisition system for the simulator had reached a critical juncture. With the help of the all-encompassing blueprints in his mind, Su Lu was sure that as long as he was given enough time to experiment, he would definitely be able to complete the modification of the simulation system and use the power in his body to directly operate mecha. If he could really succeed, it would undoubtedly be a revolutionary breakthrough in mecha control. Unfortunately, this method could only be used by Su Lu alone, or perhaps by Uncle Feng Yu, or perhaps by the Lees of Philadelphia. Su Lu was able to accomplish this because, other than relying on Professor Shen's laboratory's enormous database and its rich material inventory, more importantly, he had built an extremely solid foundation of practical experience under the subtle influence and guidance of Uncle Feng Yu over the years. More importantly, of course, were those strange blueprints in his mind. Those structures and designs that were vaguely beyond the current level of the Federation's technology were not necessarily perfect. In fact, many of them were completely unfeasible. However, those strange and even absurd design concepts and structures had given Su Lu great inspiration. Without the inspiration and help of these blueprints, he definitely would not have been able to complete the full modification of the signal acquisition system for the simulation system by himself. It should be known that any research in the Federation's field of study had to be built on the basis of a large number of experiments and design simulations. No expert had ever been able to completely modify a system by himself. In a situation where no one knew, in a laboratory in the Husk Institute's 3rd Division, there was a young civilian second lieutenant who had produced results that were destined to shock many people. However, Su Lu needed the opportunity to experiment. That would require him to interact with a mecha alone for a long period of time. And this was relatively difficult. The Federation mecha was an absolute secret. With Su Li's current level of secrecy, although he could access the information, he could not reasonably request to come into contact with the actual mecha. In order to convert his virtual designs on the holographic screen desktop into reality, Su Lu needed to be able to solve the several difficult problems in the engineering department. Only then would he be able to enter the core area of the engineering department and experiment with his own things. However, the problem of the twin engines was not something the current Su Lu could solve. He stared blankly at the blueprints on the holographic screen desktop, his brows furrowed tightly. The complex power system was completely different from the simulation system. Not to mention coming up with an effective solution, just the terrifying amount of calculations and capturing the trajectory of the electron jets were already abnormally difficult. Chapter 174. The newest generation of mecha developed by Shell Motor Company had yet to be named. Internally, it was temporarily known as the MX. This generation of mecha had been developed for over 10 years. Compared to the previous series of M52 mecha, the MX mecha had a decisive breakthrough in terms of power. The MX mecha still used Jingnong's high-energy batteries as its power source. However, 2 of the newest jet engines were installed at the back of the mecha's waist. These engines could instantly increase the mecha's power output to 4 times that of the M52 mecha. This design was undoubtedly a bold and genius idea. After 10 years of research, after overcoming a series of material and microelectronics difficulties, the multi-engine technology of a warship had finally been successfully transplanted into a mecha. The realization of this idea not only made the engineers of the entire Shell Motor Company rejoice, the federal military also felt an unprecedented excitement. 2 times the normal power in a steady state, 4 times the normal power in an instant, this was an indicator of leapfrogging development. If placed on the battlefield, the MX mecha with 4 times the normal power could completely rely on its powerful mobility to treat the old mecha like a clumsy child. What made the military most excited was that if the multi-engine technology matured in the future and the mobility of the military mecha increased once more, then in a situation where the energy consumption of a warship was decreasing by the day, typical long-range weapons on the battlefield, such as self-propelled cannons or fiber-optic guided rockets, would find it very difficult to hit a mecha that was evading at extremely high speed. If that day really came, then in a war between the Federation and the Empire, other than the warships suspended in space as a deterrent, these extremely mobile military mecha would no longer be used for special operations. They could also be placed on the battlefield as the main force for advancement. Without a doubt, this would be a fundamental change in the nature of war. Currently, only 14 prototypes of the MX mecha developed by Shell Motor Company Engineering Department and the federal military had been produced. However, the production speed demonstrated in the laboratory had already satisfied all parties. It would take at least 2 years for this new batch of mecha to undergo mass production and become a true fighting force. Moreover, the federal military did not know whether the Empire had made any breakthroughs in the multi-engine technology of the mecha. Thus, the federal military had given the Shell Motor Company an exceptionally strict time limit. Between the Federation and the Empire, no matter which side was the first to possess this type of high-performance mecha and throw them into battle, they would definitely win the initiative of the war. The Federation had an old saying, lose a nail, break a hoof, break a hoof, break a war horse, wound a knight, lose a battle. This type of mythical battle, which could only be seen in movies and novels, had never appeared in the history of the Federation. However, this demonstrated the importance of details and logistics in war. Moreover, the new generation of the MX mecha could change certain forms of war, using the power of technology to bring about changes in the strength of war. Therefore, when the Department of National Defense gave the Shell Motor Company a strict time limit, the head of the engineering department and the engineering staff were not at all surprised. They also understood the significance of the mecha they had developed. If they wanted to leave their name in history as an engineering staff, then the development of the MX mecha this time would definitely be the best opportunity. Time was of the essence. After 10 years of research and development had ended and standard laboratory parameters had been obtained and simulated, the Shell Motor Company Engineering Department sent the 4MX prototype mecha to the Whitewater Company for its subordinate Whitewater Company to use in the regional conflicts in the Bermuda Triangle Star region to obtain first-hand data on the battlefield. The regional conflicts in the Bermuda Triangle Star region had never stopped, and the experimental weapons planet chosen by the Whitewater Company was also far from the parts of the Empire where spies could infiltrate. All of this was for the sake of secrecy. Even so, the federal military still sent out the most powerful warship of the 3rd Military Region to follow the Whitewater Company's combat team from afar and enter the Bermuda Triangle Star region. On one hand, it was to cooperate with the Shell Motor Company Engineering Department in collecting data, and on the other hand, it was naturally for the sake of secrecy. On that barren mineral planet, all the refugees and thugs who could come into contact with the new MX prototype mecha had to die in the end. For the birth of a new generation of mecha to require the protection of a fleet, this fully demonstrated the importance of this matter to the Federation. The small group of thugs on that barren mineral planet was eliminated by the Whitewater Company's combat team in 7 days. Under the lockdown of the 3rd Military Region's fleet, this news was not leaked and did not attract the attention of any other forces. However, when the engineers of the Shell Motor Company Engineering Department carefully calculated the data of the new mecha on the battlefield, they discovered a very fatal problem. If this problem was not solved, the Federation's new generation of mecha, the MX, could only stand quietly in the laboratory forever and never become a powerful weapon in the battle between the Federation and the Empire. This difficult problem alarmed all the senior executives of the Shell Motor Company's board of directors and engineering department. It angered the federal military, who had been waiting excitedly for the results of the experiment. Everyone was waiting for the birth of a new generation of mecha, but in the end, they were greeted with such terrible news. The Federation's new generation of MX-type mecha was a top secret among top secrets. Therefore, the research and development work for the past 10 years was basically done by the Shell Motor Company engineering department alone. Although the higher-ups of the Department of Defense occasionally thought about whether they should let the experts from the Guizhong Company, or at least the Husk Institute or the Federal Academy of Science participate in the research, this was because the Guizhong Company's multi-engine design was undoubtedly the world's leading technology. However, due to the reasons of secrecy, these ideas were not implemented in the end. Last autumn, the Whitewater Company's battle experiment on the edge of the Bermuda Triangle star field exposed a fatal problem with the new generation of MX-type mecha. The Shell Motor Company engineering department had been unable to solve this problem, so the human resources manager, Jose, had personally poached people during the spring recruitment. He wanted to find some inspiration from these young, outstanding engineers with no inherent experience. Unfortunately, this batch of outstanding young people had only entered the engineering department for a short period of time. They were unable to provide any help to solve the inherent problem of the new generation of mecha. Moreover, the pressure from the federal military was too great, so the engineering department had no choice but to ask for help from the outside world. When Su Lu had first seen that email, he had already been stunned by the genius of the twin-engine design. Those seemingly complex but actually simple lines had already become extremely streamlined in his eyes, giving off an existence of infinite beauty and enjoyment. Before his eyes, there was a faint metallic glow. This was the culmination of the collective wisdom of the Federation engineers. Every part of the design had gone through endless deductions and calculations, and could not be changed at all. Or rather, in the eyes of a mature engineer, it was impossible for them to even think of destroying such a beautiful design. The Research Institute had officially joined in the research and development of the new generation of mecha, mainly to solve the problem that the new generation of MX mecha had exposed in battle. However, this was still the Federation's most top-secret and cutting-edge technology, so researchers like Su Lu could only obtain the relevant data and blueprints through email. They were unable to fully understand the power model of that prototype mecha. Su Li's life interest was in this aspect. Moreover, he now had some hidden reasons to enter the engineering department and have an independent space to research mecha. Thus, these past few days, he had been very attentive to this matter. He was just a junior researcher who had just completed his systematic education. How could he solve a problem that even the best engineers of the Federation could not solve just by relying on these schematics that were as simple as a leopard's skin? If it had been anyone else, perhaps looking at those blueprints and that problem in the email, they would have felt a sense of powerlessness and dejectedly give up. But Su Lu knew that he had talent in this area, and even more so, he knew that those blueprints in his mind were an existence that bordered on miraculous. If he could solve the problem of the new generation of MX mecha, for an engineer, this was an irresistible temptation. Thus, in these past few days, Su Li's attention was completely focused on the laboratory, using an unimaginable speed to carry out design simulations, calculations, and inferences. The new generation of MX mecha was a groundbreaking dual-engine design, with one main engine and one auxiliary engine. The main engine was like the power output system of previous mecha, driving the mecha's movement speed. Meanwhile, the auxiliary engine was the crux of this system. If the jet design was combined with small wings to assist with balance, the mecha could instantly increase its speed in battle, raising the performance of the entire mecha to a terrifying degree. In the engineering department's laboratory, the dual-engine design transplanted from warship multi-engine technology perfectly fulfilled the designer's original intentions. The new generation of mecha's mobility was fully demonstrated. However, in Whitewater Company's experimental use, after 1.5 minutes of continuous battle, the dual-engine system of the 4 new generation mecha would completely fail. There was even one new generation of mecha that had experienced an irreversible explosion in the midst of an experimental battle. The investigation report after the incident pointed out that there was a major difference between the data collected by the Nutshell Engineering Department in the experiment and the actual battle, resulting in this accident. The new generation of mecha's dual-engine design would enter the full power stage at the end. When both engines were pumping out maximum power, the internal Z4 suction electron jets would experience severe instability in their trajectories. This would cause cracks to appear in the high-strength material of the engine casing, and these cracks would even spread throughout the entire mecha. In the laboratory, the full power stage of the dual engines was basically in a static state. However, in battle, the full power stage would definitely occur during the most intense moments of a battle between military mecha. The instability of the electron jets would be greatly magnified when the mecha was moving at high speed, leading to unexpected consequences. It could be that the engines would simultaneously shut down for self-protection, or it could also be that it would explode. Problems occurring were not scary. After all, this was a new generation of mecha that was epoch-making. Just the adjustments in the laboratory alone could not accomplish everything. The key was to discover the problem. This time, the problem discovered on the planet at the edge of the Bermuda Triangle did not cause the engineers of the engineering department to feel anxious at the start. If there was a problem, there would be a solution. However, when the top engineers of the Federation easily discovered the problem, they were extremely saddened to find that this problem was basically very difficult to solve. Translator, Ryuxinji Editor, H2DH2 Mr. Translator, H2DH2 Mr. Editor, H2DH2 Mr. Translator, Ryuxinji Editor, H2DH2 Mr. Translator, H2DH2 Mr. Editor, H2DH2 Mr. Translator, Ryuxinji Editor, H2DH2 Mr. Translator, H2DH2 Mr. The power source of a mecha was a high-energy battery. The electron jets converted the power in the power source into electron jets that traveled at close to the speed of light. These electrons would then be shot into the space of the engine, where they would be converted into usable energy. Through the mecha's complex transmission system, the mecha would move. The electron jets were the most intricate part of this system, and also the least eye-catching part. The engineering department's design was still based on the old design. From their perspective, the twin engines only added an additional electron jet channel. There was no fundamental difference. No one would have thought that this normally inconspicuous electron jet would become a dangerous bomb in the new MX-type mecha. Reducing the wave interference between the twin engines was easily accomplished by the engineers, but they had no way of completely dissipating this type of interference in such a tight system. As long as there was a single point of interference, those electron beams inside the normally silent electron jets would suddenly become as sensitive as a virgin. They would either turn their heads shyly or run away, or silently stroke a willow, or tear apart their own clothes in anger with a red face. The problem lay within the Z4 electron jets. With the current level of technology of the Federation, there were many ways to control the trajectories of the electron beams. However, those methods required the use of large-scale equipment, so they could only be installed on a battleship and could not be used on a mecha. Once the high-speed electron beams diverged, they would enter a kind of vortex state. Under the control of a field, they would flow in all directions. If they could figure out the trajectories of the electron beams during the full power phase of the twin engines, then the engineers of the Federation would definitely be able to design the corresponding sensing equipment to redirect these electron jets back into the space of the engines. However, the problem was that the trajectories of the high-speed electron jets could not be measured. In the lost quantum state, the Federation's tens of thousands of years of research would never be able to solve this problem. The development of the new generation mecha of the Federation seemed like it would be ruined by this small electron jet. After experiencing countless failures, Sulu sank into silence. 7 days had already passed. Looking at those complicated blueprints on the holographic screen desktop, he still could not find any direction. The blueprints that flashed through his mind like a dream were indeed of great help to him. Thus, in 7 days, he had already tried more than 50 designs. This speed had already surpassed the imaginations of the top designers in Shell Motor Corporation engineering department. However, they were still failures. No matter how whimsical the design was, in front of that mischievous electron beam, they were still tangible objects. There was no way to capture their trajectories. He stared silently at the three-dimensional screenshot of the Z4 electron jets on the holographic screen. Suddenly, his brows furrowed. He understood something. In such a small system, it was impossible to capture the electron beams. To solve this problem, they had to predict the trajectories of these electron beams in advance from the moment the electron beams were interfered with. However, the problem was, according to the theories of the Federation's scientific community, the trajectories of high-speed electron jets should be random. How could they predict it? Quantum immeasurable. Subconsciously, Su Li's eyes lit up. His finger clicked open the index tree in the middle of the database. He opened Professor Shen's research results that had not made any progress over the years. Quantum immeasurable dynamics. Old Professor Shen's papers had been published before. The chief editors of the academic journals, as well as the highly respected people in the academic community, only wrote some replies out of respect for this Nebula Award winner. However, no one supported old Professor Shen's views. Su Li silently and quickly checked the research results of old Professor Shen over the years. His eyes narrowed more and more, and became brighter and brighter. As the scientific community of the Federation said, the unpredictability of quantum dynamics was basically an axiom. Although old Professor Shen's theories seemed simple and beautiful, there was not the slightest possibility that they could be proven. Speaking from the opposite side, they could not even be proven false. It was just a beautiful and illusory bubble. However, this bubble was so real in front of Su Li's eyes. He simply moved a chair and sat in front of the table. He forgot about the simulation system modification and began to seriously and interestedly learn Professor Shen's theories from the beginning. A beam of electrons traveling at close to the speed of light, within a certain order of magnitude, after being disturbed by a fixed wave band, what kind of trajectory would it follow? What kind of beautiful flower would it turn into? While Su Lu was alone in the laboratory, constantly guessing what kind of flower that beam of electrons would turn into, there were countless researchers like him in the Federal Academy of Science, Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute, and the Engineering Department. All of them were fully immersed in the battle to solve the Z4 electron jet. Most people did not know that this problem was related to the Federation's newest generation of military mecha. After experiencing countless failures, many people gave up. However, Su Lu did not give up. This was because he knew that this was a critical moment for the Federation's newest generation of mecha. Speaking of which, it was strange. It seemed that he had a much higher security clearance in the research institute than the average researcher. However, an unexpected incident disrupted the rhythm of Su Li's life. Seeing the man in the military uniform walk into the elevator with a gloomy expression, Su Lu put out the cigarette in his hand, held it in his hand, and walked into the ward. He looked at the pale and nervous girl on the bed, smiled, and said, "Did your family ask you to go back?" Zhou Yu nodded tiredly and said, "Since the doctor said there's no big problem, I don't want to go back for the time being. You know, the most important thing for pregnant women is their mood. Since you know, then you should make yourself feel better," Su Lu advised. For some reason, Zhou Yu found herself bleeding a little in the bathroom last night. Amidst that scream, Su Lu rushed in anxiously and sent her to Wangdu Hospital immediately. After the doctor's examination, it was confirmed that Zhou Yu was at risk of miscarriage. Su Lu was nervous but also a little surprised. Zhou Yu's health was excellent. Recently, she had completely stopped smoking and drinking. For her to have signs of miscarriage, it could only be something else. Could it be that she was frightened at Lin Yuan restaurant that day? He looked at Zhou Yu on the bed. After a moment of silence, he said, "I can understand. You're very nervous right now." Zhou Yu stared blankly at the snow-white ceiling above her head. After a while, she said, "You don't understand. You men will never understand. When a mother finds out that once the child in her womb is born, it can only be an illegitimate child pointed at by others, how terrible her mood is. Sulu was a careful and sensitive person, but it didn't mean that he could read all the thoughts of the people around him. After hearing these words, he was stunned and his mood became heavy. This was indeed a problem that Zhou Yu and the child in her womb would have to face. If others asked now, he could still say that he was the father of Zhou Yu's child in her womb. But what about the future? The child would grow up eventually, and Shi Qinghai, he still didn't know if he was still alive. Zhou Yu retracted her gaze and looked coldly at Sulu. She said, "You said that you would be responsible for me and the child in my womb on behalf of Shi Qinghai. How are you going to take responsibility?" "I don't know," Sulu answered honestly. Zhou Yu closed her eyes and was silent for a long time. After a long time, she said softly, "Forget it. This has nothing to do with you. If I hadn't insisted, maybe you wouldn't have wanted this child in the first place. This is my child. It has nothing to do with you." Sulu suddenly realized that when he was with Zhou Yu, he would talk more and more. Did this mean that he already saw her as a friend? Looking at the pale-faced Zhou Yu on the bed, his mood suddenly became gloomy. He subconsciously thought of the words he said to Zhang Xiaomeng when they were planning the future. "When the child registers in the future, put my name in the father column." Sulu was a guy who didn't hesitate once he made a decision. In this regard, he really didn't act like a 20-year-old young man. He was more like an old man who had weathered the hardships of life and seen through everything. Zhou Yu slowly opened her eyes and looked at him with a very strange gaze. After a while, she said softly, "Are you really crazy? You can pretend to be the child's father, but you're really going to?" Sulu smiled and didn't say anything. In the quiet Linyuan of Wangdu Hospital, Sulu retracted his gaze from upstairs. The lights in Zhou Yu's room were turned off. He stood alone in the darkness. Looking up at the starry sky, he saw 2 bright moons. It wasn't the double moon festival, so there was no ball. He once loved someone, but that person was already dead. He thought in his heart that he would probably never fall in love again. He walked to the trash can and was about to throw in the cigarette but in his hand when he suddenly stopped. Sulu slowly tore open the filter and tore the sponge inside one by one. He tore the sponge into a thin and fluffy mess. He thought in his heart, Uncle was right back then. The life of the people in the Federation was indeed like a mess. What kind of shape will this beam of electrons turn into after it dissipates? In the quiet laboratory, Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the constantly changing image on the holographic screen table. The trajectory of the electron beam in the theoretical model was like a child who would never settle down. It was riding a roller coaster with different curves. Sometimes it protruded, sometimes it turned back. Sometimes it was like a flower, but most of the time it was like a cloud of fog. It will turn into a mess. An old voice sounded behind him. An old finger reached over and slowly entered a few extremely unfamiliar parameters into the theoretical calculation model on the holographic screen table. At the same time, a simple formula was added. The finger seemed to have magic. As the parameters and formulas were entered, the chaotic fog of the electron beam on the holographic screen table gradually gathered and overlapped. It became clear and turned into countless fine and uniform lines that stretched and fell. It seemed to have no pattern, but in fact, there was order in the chaos. It was like a mess made of a string. As long as the end of the string was pulled, all the directions of the mess could be determined. Chapter 175. This was indeed an inconceivable feat today. In Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department, the Research Institute, and even the Federal Academy of Science, there were countless experts and scholars working hard to solve the problem of the Z4 electron jets. They could not sleep at night, and their food was tasteless. Who would have thought that an old man who had been away from the Federation's academic center for so many years, and who only had the old story of a Nebula Award winner left to him, would be able to solve this problem so easily? The electron beam composition on the screen desktop had gradually stabilized. It looked like a tangled mess, complex but stable. Su-Lu knew that predicting the trajectory of the electron beams in advance did not mean that all the problems had been solved. First, calculations and verification were needed, and then a series of tests and judgments were needed. Most importantly, a lot of time was still needed to make fundamental changes to the structure of the mecha's engine compartment to target the trajectory of the electron beams. However, most importantly, the most difficult part had been solved. The Federation's new generation of mecha would most likely be successful soon. Because he understood the importance of this matter, Su-Lu was so shocked that he was speechless for a long time. Only after a long pause did he regain his composure and say respectfully, "Professor Shen, you're back." After staying in the hospital for so many days, he still did not know what illness Professor Shen was suffering from. However, seeing the tired expression on the old man's face right now, he knew that the old man's body had not fully recovered. Professor Shen made a sound of acknowledgement and then headed up to the second floor, seemingly oblivious to the shock that the parameter formula he had entered on the screen desktop would bring to the Federation. Su-Lu had always been an extremely calm person, but at this moment, he still could not completely calm the excitement in his heart. When Professor Shen reached the office on the second floor, he immediately turned around and stared at the mess on the screen desktop. Rubbing his hands together nervously, he immediately began to record and verify the data. He was very afraid that this mess would disappear right before his eyes. Now that they had the trajectory diagram, they would need to modify the MX-type mecha's twin engines to pass through the link. Next, they would need to bring into play Su-Li's talent in mechanical design. Even though he was unable to fully understand the overall system of the engine, he was still very confident in changing the direction of the particle suction pipe according to the direction of the electron beam. Taking a deep breath, Su-Lu closed his eyes. In the darkness in front of his eyes, he searched for the light and the blueprints formed by the dots of light. From the library of strange blueprints that was as vast as stardust, he extracted the designs and perfected his own ideas. After an unknown amount of time, Su-Lu carefully looked at the design drawings on the holographic screen desktop and felt a sense of satisfaction. Although he did not immediately solve the problem of the interference of the two engines, he knew that with the help of Professor Shen, he had already set foot on the road to success. The key was Professor Shen. At this moment, his mood was slightly relaxed. Only then did he have the extra energy to turn his confused and shocked eyes back to the second floor. He couldn't help but think, what kind of person is this old professor who hides in the small building and ignores the changes in the Federation? While Su-Lu was thinking about Professor Shen, this top scientist of the Federation was also facing the holographic screen of the computer, one hand on the crutches in front of him as he pondered about the young civilian second lieutenant downstairs. The flashing data on the holographic screen were traces left behind by external operations in the laboratory's database over the past few days that Professor Shen had been hospitalized. It clearly showed that in the recent days, Su-Lu had been searching through the data index data in the laboratory alone. In the sidebar of the data trace statistics were the materials Su-Lu had applied for over the past few days, as well as the operation logs he had carried out in the laboratory. Signal collector. B-section material line. What exactly is this little guy trying to do? Professor Shen's somewhat cloudy eyes gradually lit up. From these logs, he realized that in the days that he was not there, this assistant researcher did not muddle along just because he controlled the laboratory alone. On the contrary, this person was familiarizing himself with the database at an extremely terrifying speed, and was very diligent in carrying out a certain type of research. It was just that even Professor Shen was not familiar with that type of research, so he was a bit curious as to where exactly Su-Li's research direction was. After opening the email, Professor Shen found out that during the days that he was hospitalized, there were some internal problems in the Nutshell Company. He then thought about the image captured by the electron beam emission track on the holographic screen desktop and understood something. Young people are still interested in those heavy and clumsy metal things. Professor Shen sighed. Professor Shen was once a famous figure in the Federation's scientific community. He was very accomplished in the field of engineering mechanics. Not only was he the winner of the Nebula Award, but he was also the chief designer of a series of mecha. However, many years ago, he put all of his efforts into the seemingly dead end of the research field of quantum measurable dynamics, and then gradually disappeared from people's sight. In the last few years of his life, this old professor's research did not make any breakthroughs, but he was not too disappointed. The Federation's tens of thousands of years of history had long proven that in order to make some kind of leap forward in basic theory, it would either require the tireless research of several generations, or even more than 10 generations, or it would require the appearance of a genius like the 5-person team from back then. It was more likely that the researchers would end up with nothing in the end. Professor Shen did not expect to be able to solve the difficult problem of quantum measurable dynamics while he was still alive. He only wanted to use his own heart to research what he believed to be the most important thing to research, and to provide some suggestions or directions for future generations. However, after so many years, the number of researchers following him had dwindled. After being hospitalized a few days ago, this old professor's mood had changed slightly. He knew that God did not have much time left for him, and everything in this laboratory would probably be forgotten after he died. Although his son was also an outstanding scientist in the Federation, the direction of his research was completely different from his own. Moreover, Professor Shen knew very well that his son had always held a suspicious and sad attitude towards his research over the years. If he was not his father, perhaps his son would have been more direct and sarcastic with his words. Professor Shen looked at the computer screen. Su Li's learning records and the last 3 days of the design were left behind. A glimmer of light gradually appeared on his old face. Every research assistant that followed him had a higher level of authority than the other research assistants in the Husk Institute. This was something that Su Li had never understood. In the past, when those research assistants completed the tasks assigned to them by Professor Shen, they would also carry out some of their own research on a whim. However, there had never been anyone like Su Li, who could devote all of his time to research. The records on the screen clearly showed how diligent Su Li had been in his work in the past few days when Professor Shen was not around. This was especially true when he saw that Su Li had once entered the index tree in the middle to study the quantum measurable dynamics theory that he was researching. A gratified smile flashed across the old professor's face. He had never seen such a young researcher who could remain so calm in the midst of a monotonous research career. This was an anomaly. In the past 3 days, Su Li had been designing the modification of the mecha's electronic jets. Although all of them had failed, and even the direction was wrong, to be able to come up with so many excellent designs in such a short period of time was already proof of this young second lieutenant's solid foundation. Professor Shen could even feel the boundless talent in those failed designs. In the following days, Su Li felt that something was off. Professor Shen, who was on the second floor, no longer threw countless calculations and data-gathering tasks at him like before. He suddenly had a lot of free time. Of course, he treasured this time very much. He seized every opportunity to throw himself into the modification and design of the twin-engine electronic jets. Vaguely, he felt that Professor Shen knew what he was doing and was purposely making time for him. The modification and design of the electronic jets proceeded very smoothly. With the support of Professor Shen's theories, Su Li could be said to have discovered the direction of the Great Path of Light earlier than the other researchers in the Federation. Occasionally thinking about these two matters, Su Li could not help but feel gratitude and respect for the old professor upstairs. One day, in the area of calculating the trajectory of the R-shaped electron beam, Su Li fell into a dilemma. He thought for a long time, then stood up from the holographic screen table and walked towards the second floor. "I've been waiting for you to come find me." Professor Shen sat behind his desk and took off his glasses. He smiled at Su Li and said, "A person who does not have the courage to ask about research has no future." Su Li smiled somewhat awkwardly. He walked forward and presented the problem he had encountered to Professor Shen. At this time, he noticed that although Professor Shen had been discharged from the hospital for a few days, his body seemed to still be weak. However, the old man's spirit seemed to be more vigorous. In the last few years of my life, I basically dealt with these tiny particles. The accelerators in the Academy of Sciences are as familiar as my children. But at this moment, I have to admit that the quantum size is still unpredictable. Professor Shen did not immediately discuss the electron beam problem with Su Lu. After a moment of silence, he spoke with a hint of loneliness. Su Lu paused for a second and felt a slight chill in his heart. But, under certain fixed conditions, the trajectory of quantum dynamics can be vaguely calculated. And as long as the probability is large enough, we can roughly assume that the trajectory is correct. Professor Shen looked calmly at Su Lu. His pair of cloudy eyes gradually shone with the light of wisdom. He did not know whether Su Lu could understand or not. He only knew that the things he was researching needed a young person to be able to save them for him. Although the young people of today, including Su Lu in front of him, may not have much interest in such boring physics knowledge, at least if his hard work could be saved, it would be of some use in the future. There are no problems with the twin engines designed by those fellows in the engineering department. As long as you can solve the problem of the trajectory of the electron beam in the jets, then the Federation's newest generation of mecha will be successful. Su Lu listened intently. This was the conclusion he had made a long time ago. He just did not understand why the old professor would say this. Remember to sign my name on this academic report. My name has to be at the very front, said Professor Shen. Su Lu frowned slightly. He knew that Professor Shen was not a person who craved academic fame, or else he would not have hidden in this laboratory for so many years. Moreover, regarding the design and modification of the mecha this time, the most crucial foundation was Professor Shen's theory. He did not show any displeasure. On the contrary, he vaguely understood that Professor Shen was trying to protect him. This design that was destined to shock the Federation's academic community might perhaps bring about some unpredictable future for him. Chapter 176. Su Lu knew how to answer. 2 years ago, he was still an apprentice on a remote mining planet, following a strange uncle to repair electrical appliances. Since he was young, he had a strong interest and talent in the field of mechanical repair. He had also set his life goal of entering the top mechanical company in the Federation. However, when he really became a researcher at the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute, with the military rank of a civilian second lieutenant, and truly entered the core area of the Federation's research field, he still could not fully adapt to this change in role. Just like the Federation's proverb, when dreams become reality, it will still seem like a dream. The Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute, the 3 major military academies, and the Federal Academy of Science were all part of the same system. For Su Lu, this was a foreign world. He was familiar with the metal lines and chip components, but he was not familiar with the operating principles of this world. Hearing Professor Shen's slightly mocking and angry words, he fell silent. Only now did he understand that the seemingly pure academic world was not fundamentally different from the Jianghu that the orphans of the Donglin district mingled in. Speaking of which, it was true. Things like power were applicable in the universe. Those who were already standing at the top would not allow a small character like himself to obtain enough capital through the success of the Federation's new generation of mecha. You don't have to worry about anything. At least I'm still alive. Looking at the silent Su Lu, Professor Shen suddenly thought of himself many years ago. He smiled bitterly and said, I think, whether it's the Academy of Science or the Research Institute, those fellows who have left the front line of research for a long time probably don't have the guts to steal my things. Su Lu smiled with some difficulty. While I'm still alive, I'll quickly get this done. Professor Shen put his glasses back on, bent over the table, and began to use his trembling fingers to lightly tap on the problem Su Lu had encountered. Su Lu did not disturb Professor Shen any further and quietly walked down the metal stairs. That afternoon, he saw Professor Shen's opinion on the holographic screen desktop. The problem that had troubled him for 3 hours became so clear after a few simple words of analysis. He easily found a breakthrough. Even as he marveled inwardly, Su Lu could not quite understand why the old professor would suddenly be so willing to help him. Moreover, the other should clearly know that these things involved the new generation of mecha for the Federation, but had little to do with the theoretical research that the old professor was most concerned about. In the following days, Professor Shen and Su Lu, two eccentrics, one old and one young, kept repeating the process of researching, designing, encountering obstacles, inquiring, referencing, and solving problems in a quiet and undisturbed laboratory in the research institute behind the first military academy of the Federation. The main work was done by Su Lu, but Professor Shen was the one who was actually giving them directions. The old professor still spent most of his time in the office on the second floor. He seemed to be sorting out some information. The rest of his time was spent teaching Su Lu outside of work. Su Lu and Professor Shen quickly became familiar with each other. Occasionally, they would drink tea and sit together to chat. However, the content of their conversation would definitely be considered rather boring to an outsider. When it comes to studying, you actually have to go to extremes. Professor Shen sat on the stairs on the second floor, a cup of hot tea placed beside him. He said in a trembling voice, "Back then, after I graduated from University 1, I directly entered the Husk Institute as an assistant. Later on, I made some achievements and entered the Academy of Science. I once had many glorious moments. For example, when that generation of mecha officially came off the assembly line, I was also very excited. However, when I got older, I finally understood that the mission of a scientist was not to develop machines that could kill people faster and more efficiently." Professor Shen took a sip of tea and sighed. The development of science will definitely make weapons more advanced, but the goal of scientific development is not to do so. It is to go to extremes. Large to the extreme is the universe. Small to the extreme is the quantum. Professor Shen did not look at the dazed Su Lu downstairs. He continued, "In the field of astrophysics, I am not very good at it. The creation and destruction of the universe will ultimately return to the realm of philosophy. However, I am also very bad at philosophy, so in the end, I set my sights on measuring the dynamics of the quantum. I always thought that everything in the universe should have a pattern to follow, or perhaps it should be said that there is a reason to speak of. However, in the end, I realized that the smallest is the largest. It still has to return to the realm of philosophy. I said before, I am very bad at philosophy." Professor Shen was like a child, sitting at the bottom of the stairs on the first floor as he spoke with a laugh. Su Lu sat on a chair on the first floor, a smile also appearing on his face. This kind of pure conversation without any other things was very interesting for people like them. In the entire Federation academic community, no one knew that the two people in this laboratory were currently researching the difficult problem that the Federation's newest generation of mecha were facing. Even more so, no one knew that their research progress had long left everyone else far behind. These past 2 days, Su Lu and Professor Shen had been able to drink tea and chat frequently precisely because he had confirmed that their direction was correct. It would not be long before the modification work on the new MX Mecha's electronic jets would be completed. The Federation's most difficult problem had gradually become ridiculously simple in front of these two people. The reason it was so easy was partly because Professor Shen had absolute experience and results in the field of measuring the dynamics of the quantum. Although those were just side results from his long research journey, they were already enough to provide strong theoretical support for the problems that had arisen in the new generation of mecha's power system. Those theoretical data models might have needed to be studied from scratch by other researchers, but on Professor Shen's side, they were all ready-made things. As for the other part, that was Su Li's strong learning ability and practical ability. Transforming a theoretical data model into a real design process was a very crucial part. Even an engineering department would need to spend a large amount of time performing repetitive calculations to be able to draw up the most probable structural blueprint. These past few days, Professor Shen had given Su Lu many surprises, and Su Lu had also given the old professor countless surprises. This young researcher was like a database that had gathered the wisdom of the Federation's engineers. For every data model, he would always be able to find a matching real design in the shortest amount of time. This kind of ability could not be explained, it could only be called a gift. Professor Shen looked at the young fellow downstairs and could not help but think to himself with a smile, what exactly was in this child's brain? Su Li's brain was filled with the practical ability that Uncle Feng Yu had taught him, the bold and imaginative design concepts, and in the deepest recesses of his mind were the endless structural blueprints that the Black Dream had given him. Until today, he still thought that these high-level structural blueprints were a legacy that Uncle Feng Yu had left for him. He had no idea that these blueprints were actually the greatest existence in the Federation, the most profound wisdom, the central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation, which was located who knew how many kilometers underground, had bestowed upon him this wealth in order to awaken him. The Federal Central Computer stored all the high-level structural designs that had existed for tens of thousands of years. Although these structural designs might not necessarily be able to be turned into reality, the fact that they could appear in the central computer meant that their standards were naturally incomparably profound. Under these conditions, Su Lu already possessed all the qualifications to become the most outstanding engineer in the Federation without question. Moreover, these qualifications that he possessed were so unique that they could not be replicated. From an apprentice, he was about to become the one who decided the fate of the most advanced mecha in the Federation. Su Li's mood was relaxed and joyful, but he could not help but feel a little perplexed. He reflexively fished out a cigarette from his pocket and lit it, but he immediately remembered that the old professor was looking at him from upstairs. He raised his head awkwardly and saw Professor Shen's eyes light up. The two fingers resting on his knees slowly spread open. I haven't smoked in a long time. Professor Shen took a deep drag on his cigarette and unskillfully blew out a broken smoke ring. In his early years, when he was addicted to nights in the laboratory, this top scientist of the Federation was also used to never leaving his hand without a cigarette. However, when the war between the Federation and the Empire broke out, Professor Shen resolutely gave up smoking for the sake of the slogan, working healthily for the Federation for 50 years. In the blink of an eye, it had already been several decades. The old man and the young man sat on the metal staircase on the second floor of the laboratory, smoking cigarettes and chatting idly. They were very much like the bored passers-by at the entrance of a supermarket in the capital special district. However, Professor Shen was looking at all the details in the laboratory. Everything here had been pieced together by him, bit by bit. Su Lu was sizing up Professor Shen from the corner of his eyes. The yellowish-brown spots on the old man's face were getting darker and brighter. In the past few days, the professor's spirits had been extremely good, but Su Lu kept feeling that there was a bad omen in his heart. That night, Su Lu returned to his apartment in Wangdu. After washing Zhou Yu's hair, he shut himself in his bedroom and lay on the bed with his eyes open. He stared at the ceiling above his head in a daze. The endless pictures in his mind moved according to his will. It was a map of the Donglin district full of mines and green fields. Naturally, he thought of Uncle Feng Yu. In the past few days, he had spent all day and night with Professor Shen and received a lot of sincere praise. Only now did he truly understand how much Uncle Feng Yu had taught him during his days at the repair shop in the Donglin district when he taught him how to repair home appliances. Su Lu felt that his luck in life was pretty good. Although his life was a bit messy, starting from the Donglin district, he often met some nobles. The so-called nobles were people who sincerely helped him. Uncle Feng Yu was like that, and so was Professor Shen. The next day, he walked into the research institute in silence as usual. However, as he walked in, his mood became strange. This was because the colleagues he met on the way, besides greeting him, all looked at him with a very complicated gaze. In front of the laboratory door, he saw a few officials in military uniforms. They were probably the supervisors of the technical department of the Shell Motor Company. Without the authorization of the chip, these officials could only wait outside the laboratory door. Second Lieutenant Su Lu. Yes. Let me inform you of something. Su Li's hands clenched tightly. He could not believe the news he had just heard. The breakfast in the paper bag in his hand was slightly distorted by his grip. This was a small yellow pancake for Professor Shen. Yesterday, the old professor had said that although his teeth were not in good condition, he really wanted to eat this. Chapter 177. It was only recently that Su Lu and Professor Shen had become familiar with each other. Unfortunately, the time they had spent together was too short. Professor Shen had already left this world. He stood at the entrance of the laboratory in a daze. It took him a while to digest the shocking and sad news. Professor Shen was already very old. His health had always been poor. Last month, he had been hospitalized for a long time. Recently, when Su Lu sat on the metal stairs and chatted with him, he could always smell a hint of inauspiciousness from the old man's seemingly exuberant energy. However, he still did not expect that this respectable old professor would pass away so quickly. Birth, aging, illness, and death came so suddenly and without reason. Su Lu was still immersed in this slightly frustrated and sad mood. His silence made the expressions of the several officials at the entrance of the laboratory a little ugly. One of the officials frowned and said impatiently, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and open the door of the laboratory." These words pulled Su Lu out of his sad mood. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the several indifferent officials in front of him. Only then did he realize that the situation today was a little strange. Professor Shen's death was indeed a big deal. However, there was no reason why the high-level officials of the research institute, especially the technical director who was directly responsible to the board of directors, would personally come to the laboratory to inform an inconspicuous assistant researcher of the news. Since these people did not specifically come to inform him of Professor Shen's death, and were in such a hurry to enter the laboratory, it was natural that they had other motives. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the indifferent faces of these officials. It was obvious that they did not feel the slightest bit of sadness because of Professor Shen's death. This kind of behavior made Su Lu feel heavy and slightly angry. "Why do you want to open the door of the laboratory?" After a moment of silence, Su Lu directly answered. This answer was obviously not expected by the several high-level officials. They frowned and looked at Su Lu as if they were looking at garbage. One of them said coldly, "When the higher-ups do things, do they need to explain the details to you?" "No need." Su Lu lowered his head slightly and replied, "But this laboratory belongs to the scope of co-construction. According to the agreement, unless Professor Shen agrees or the board of directors issues a written order, I can't open the laboratory and let you in. Get your facts straight, I'm the director of the 3rd division of the Research Institute. This person beside me is the technical director of the board of directors." The official was stunned. He didn't expect the assistant researcher in front of him to reject his request so calmly and confidently. He angrily reprimanded, "Open the door for me." Su Lu shook his head and stood at the entrance of the laboratory. He didn't take out the electronic key card and scan the chip. After working at the Husk Institute for so many days and chatting with Professor Shen, he already knew how the Husk Institute cooperated with the famous professors. The Husk Institute provided the relevant research conditions to these professors, and the final research results were shared between the two parties according to the agreement. This was a relatively free cooperation model, which was more suitable for professors who liked freedom to use their abilities. What's more, Professor Shen was basically in the periphery these years, and he didn't provide any research results to the Federation. The technical support provided by the Professor Shen was extremely limited. Even the tools and materials in the laboratory were privately sponsored by Professor Shen. Without the authorization of Professor Shen or a written order from the company, no one was allowed to enter the laboratory. In this case, why did the company's top officials suddenly appear at the entrance of the laboratory and are so anxious to go in? Su Lu understood the reason behind this, but because of the indifference shown by the other party, and the feeling that something was wrong, he silently blocked the entrance of the laboratory. "Who do you think you are? How dare you block my way? The director of the third department of the institute looked at Su Lu in front of him with his head down, as if he didn't hear him and didn't see him. He suddenly felt embarrassed and pointed his finger at Su Li's nose and scolded loudly, "This is the last time I'm telling you, hurry up and open the door of the laboratory and hand over your electronic key card. You don't have to come to work tomorrow. You are a senior officer, but even if you want to fire an active soldier, you don't have the right to do so." Su Lu raised his head and calmly looked at the several officials in front of him, and said, "As a soldier, I have to do things according to the rules. Where are the military police?" The director's eyes emitted a cold light. He didn't want to waste time with this strange low-level researcher. He looked at Su Lu and said angrily, "The laboratory is the property of the company, the property of the Federation. Do you think it's yours, or old Shen's? Do you think you can't enter the institute if you don't open the door?" With the powerful strength of the Husk Institute, it was no doubt very easy to open the electronic door of a laboratory. Today, when these officials heard the news of Professor Shen's death, they rushed to the laboratory immediately. They didn't choose to enter directly, but instead waited for Su Li's arrival. Naturally, they didn't want this matter to be solved in a more peaceful and discreet way. However, they didn't expect this young researcher to unexpectedly block the door so valiantly and not let them enter. The officials had lost their patience and directly called for the military police. "There's no need for the military police, I can walk by myself." Su Li's voice became louder, and it echoed in the quiet corridor. Gradually, many researchers wearing white coats walked out of the adjacent laboratory. The crowd looked at the conflict with puzzled eyes. Su Lu looked at the arrogant and angry officials in front of him and said loudly, "Professor Shen's body is not cold yet, and you want to force your way into the laboratory? Are you planning to steal something? Unless you show me a written order from the board of directors, don't expect me to open the door for you. Everyone knows that when the person is gone, the coffee will naturally be cold. But Professor Shen has just passed away, and you can't wait to come here. Don't you think you are a bit too shameless?" At this time, Su Li's mood was unusually cold. He still hadn't gotten over the sad news of Professor Shen's death, and now he had to face these hateful officials. However, the anger and shame on his face were fake. Today, he said so many words like a hot-blooded young man. It was because he knew that a mere civilian second lieutenant, an assistant researcher who had just joined the company for a few months, could not stop the company's management from entering the laboratory, so he had to make his voice louder and let more people know about this. Both sides of the long corridor were full of laboratories. The staff of the research institute were not people who liked to watch a scene, but they all knew the news of Professor Shen's death last night. At this moment, they found that Professor Shen's assistant was arguing with the company's management, so they all cast worried eyes. They understood what happened and looked at the officials with disdain. Although they didn't know what was in Professor Shen's laboratory, the company wanted to seal the laboratory as soon as the professor passed away. From an emotional point of view, it was really difficult for them to accept. At this time, a team of fully armed military police, after receiving the order from the management, rushed from the end of the corridor to the door of the laboratory. They vigilantly surrounded Su Lu, ready to subdue him at any time. At this time, the technical chief of the board of directors of the Nutshell Company, who had been silent, whispered a few words in the ear of the director of the 3 departments. Probably these senior officials were not willing to go too far in the current situation. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and did not give these officials a chance to turn around in front of the crowd. He directly said loudly, "If you have the ability, then force the door of the laboratory open today. If you don't follow the rules, then I will appeal according to the rules. I will sue the board of directors. If it doesn't work, then I will sue the Ministry of National Defense. If even the Ministry of National Defense is nothing in your eyes, then I will sue the Supreme Court. Don't underestimate my determination." After saying this, Su Lu did not look at the faces of the senior officials that were getting worse and worse. He directly pulled away the guns in the hands of the military police and walked out of the corridor without looking back. He tightly held the bag of small yellow pancakes in his hand and thought about what Professor Shen said yesterday. Everything in the universe should be reasonable. Walking to the empty and quiet parking lot of the Research Institute, not far from the military police who were monitoring him, Su-lu silently dialed a number. A few days ago, when he was smoking and chatting with Professor Shen, Su-lu got the old man's phone number. Thinking that the owner of the number had left this world, he naturally felt sad. Then he heard a voice from the other side of the phone. In the special ward area of the Chester Private Hospital, Su-lu silently looked at the car that was pushed into the cold room. Thinking about the peaceful face of the old man in the car, he took off the military cap on his head, held it in his arms, and bowed deeply. Father passed away very peacefully. Professor Shen's eyes were slightly red. He smiled and said to Su-lu, actually, when he was hospitalized last time, the doctor had clearly told him that he would not last for more than a few days. Su-lu thought about the work he had done with Professor Shen in the laboratory a few days ago. Now that he thought about it, he did not feel that the old man was gradually approaching death. Death is something that everyone will face. Professor Shen lowered his head and said, in the last few days, when Father came home, he was in a good mood. I think it should have something to do with you. Thank you. Su-lu did not know how to respond to this sentence, but he fell into a complicated mood. Facing the inevitable death, counting the last bell, the old man still calmly taught him and helped him. What kind of state was this? My relationship with Father was not very good in the past. It was probably because when he was young, he was always working for the Federation and neglected his family. When Mother died, he was not by her side. Professor Shen raised his head and looked at the closed door. He thought about his father, who was separated by a wall, and his voice became sad. I used to hate him very much, but later, when I was doing the same work, I understood a little. That is why I did not marry. People like us who have dedicated our lives to science may not have the right to have a normal family life. Professor Shen turned around and said calmly, Father changed his will 2 days ago. The laboratory in the 3rd department of the Research Institute will be given to you to continue using. Except for the relevant database rights in the agreement, which may be returned to the Federation, the other results of Father's research, as well as the data and materials, he left them all to you. Chapter 178. Why me? These past few years, the Research Institute, First Academy, and the Academy of Science have all transferred over 40 research assistants to Father's lab, but none of them lasted for more than 3 months. This is because everyone knows that the direction of Father's research has no future. Professor Shen gazed at Su-lu with a gentle gaze and said, other than their daily work, those research assistants were not even interested in Father's research on quantum dynamics. Before Father passed away, he said that in all these years, you were the only one who had taken the initiative to flip through the things he had researched. Su-lu lowered his head in silence, a trace of guilt growing in his heart. When he had first entered the lab, he had not been any different from those research assistants. It was only because he was used to being squeezed dry by Uncle Fengyu that he had been more proactive and diligent in his work. As for the field of quantum dynamics that Professor Shen had researched, Su-lu had not had any interest in it. If it were not for the fact that the Federation's newest generation of mecha had encountered a problem that coincided with Professor Shen's research, he might not have even opened that index tree. Thinking of this, a light flashed through Su-li's mind. Vaguely, he seemed to have guessed why those senior technocrats had been so eager to enter the lab after Professor Shen had passed away. However, he still could not confirm this point. Seeing that the young assistant had fallen silent, Professor Shen thought that the young assistant would not be able to accept the sudden news. He smiled and said, "What I research is deep or veins. The direction of my research is completely different from Father's. The things in that lab are useless even if he left them to me. If he left them to you, at least Father will be able to account for the 10 or so years he spent researching alone." After a moment of silence, Su-lu told the other about what had happened at the Research Institute this morning. After all, the other was Professor Shen's son. Whether it was from a legal standpoint or from a personal standpoint, he needed Professor Shen to give him an opinion on the unreasonable demands of those senior technocrats. I'm afraid I won't be of much help in this matter. A trace of pain appeared in Professor Shen's calm eyes. Like his father, he devoted himself to research. His father left everything in the laboratory to Su Lu, and he had no objection. However, when he heard that the company's bureaucrats wanted to force their way into the laboratory before his father's body was even cold, he still felt sad and angry even though he didn't know what those bureaucrats wanted. Here are some files, some of my father's work notes, and some legal documents. I didn't read it carefully, but the agreement that father signed with the Husk Institute should be in there. Professor Shen handed Su Lu a micro-storage device and seriously said, if you really want to go to court in the future, let me know. I'm willing to testify for you. People who engage in research are always more naive. The Husk Company represented the will of the entire Federation. At least, the several senior officials who suddenly appeared this morning represented the will of some of the forces in the Federation. Whether it was Professor Shen or Su Lu, in front of this force, they all seemed so small and pitiful. Su Lu believed that if those officials really wanted to enter Professor Shen's laboratory, they would have countless ways and reasons to do so. Professor Shen's request to testify in court would probably never become a reality. The officials simply wouldn't let this matter go to court. A glass of white wine spilled on the table. This was the custom of the Donglin district. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the wine stains on the table. He remembered what Professor Shen said that day. While I'm still alive, I'll do it. However, Professor Shen had suddenly passed away just like that. Su Li's eyes narrowed more and more. The conjecture he had in the hospital gradually surfaced in his mind. It became clearer and clearer, more and more realistic. It looked like the researchers of some departments had probably gradually discovered the importance of Professor Shen's research results in the process of developing the new generation of mecha for the Federation. Other than the development of the new generation of mecha for the Federation, what else could make those officials so nervous? They actually wanted to force their way into the laboratory right after Professor Shen's death. Subconsciously, Su Lu took out a thin piece of small yellow pancake from the paper bag beside him. He slowly chewed on it and poured himself a glass of wine. The wine was mixed with the aroma of grains, giving off a spicy and painful taste. He took a deep breath and made up his mind. No matter what those officials thought, and no matter whether he could protect the laboratory, at least the electron jet must be successfully developed in his hands. On the new generation of mecha for the Federation, Professor Shen's name must be written. Su Lu was a calm and collected person. In the past few days, his emotions had been stirred by the new generation of mecha. That was because he liked it, because it was his life's dream. Moreover, he needed to use the success of the mecha to help himself achieve a certain goal. Other than that, his heart was like a boulder. However, the person had already passed away. What belonged to Professor Shen should belong to Professor Shen. What belonged to him should belong to him. For an orphan who was like a rock in Donglin, there was no one to snatch. Things could be shared. If someone snatched it, then he would snatch it as fiercely as a cub. What happened? Zhou Yu frowned and looked at Su Li's solemn expression. She looked at the wine on the table and the others furrowed brows because of the spiciness. She knew that something must have happened to this ordinary young man today. Professor Shen has passed away due to illness. Even without chatting with Su Lu, Zhou Yu knew who Professor Shen was. There were not many Nebula Award winners left in the Federation. She was silent for a moment and then turned on the television. The news was broadcasting the news of Professor Shen's death. This old man who was far away from the Federation's academic center and had gradually been forgotten by the citizens of the Federation had finally shocked the numb world. In an instant, many people remembered Professor Shen's outstanding contributions to the Federation back in the day. Su Lu did not look at the news. He only listed out his goal and process in detail in his mind, analyzing where he had gone wrong and where he could make up for it. Suddenly, he stared blankly at Zhou Yu on the sofa for a very long time. Zhou Yu was not used to being stared at by him and said coldly, "What's wrong with you?" "Professor Shen has been helping me research something recently. Specifically, this thing involves the success of the Federation's new generation of mecha." Su Lu drank another glass of strong wine and narrowed his eyes. He told Zhou Yu everything that had happened in the past few days. Zhou Yu became more and more engrossed as she listened. Her eyes lit up. As the daughter of the Deputy Minister of National Defense, she was not an ignorant and incompetent person. Of course, she knew that what Su Lu was saying now was of great significance to the federal military and even to the war between the Federation and the Empire. The more important the matter was, the more benefits it would bring and the more attention it would attract. Zhou Yu was silent for a long time before she suddenly said, "Since the Husk Institute places so much importance on your laboratory, it looks like many people already know that the success of the new mecha cannot be separated from Professor Shen's research. The problem is, we don't know how much those people know. Is it because their research has run into problems and they need the information from Professor Shen's laboratory? Or is it because they already know that you are close to success and want to snatch the fruits of your labor?" After so many days of interaction, Zhou Yu had already naturally referred to Su Lu and himself as "we." Su Lu thought for a while and said, "It should be the former. No one can protect the laboratory." Zhou Yu looked at him seriously and said, "You are an employee of Nutshell and also a civilian soldier directly under the Ministry of National Defense. No matter what your identity is, you are just a small fry." Su Lu looked at her quietly. "Don't look at me. My father is indeed a soldier with a technical background. He should have some influence on Nutshell, but this matter, the benefits involved are too great." Zhou Yu lowered her eyes slightly and said, "Even if you ask Lady Tai to help, those people will not give up. You seem to have guessed which important person wants to snatch Professor Shen's things." Zhou Yu hesitated for a long time before saying softly, "The Federal Academy of Science. Dean Lin." Su Lu frowned. He could not believe his ears. In the hearts of the average citizen of the Federation, the Federal Academy of Science was an incomparably noble and holy place. Dean Lin's prestige was even higher. Back when Su Lu was a mechanic, he had also greatly admired the expert who had single-handedly taken on the task of developing the M52 mecha. Dean Lin is the youngest Nebula Award recipient in history, 11 years earlier than Professor Shen. But there has always been an unconfirmed rumor. Back then, Dean Lin and Professor Shen worked in the same laboratory. Dean Lin's Nebula Award recipient results were plagiarized from Professor Shen's research. The head of the Academy of Science plagiarized. Can a person really be that shameless? Su Lu frowned. Zhou Yu raised her head and said calmly, "It's just a rumor. No one has proof, and no one dares to bring it up. The position of the head of the Federal Academy of Science is too sensitive, too detached. Neither the politicians nor the military are willing to offend him. To be able to discover the importance of measuring quantum dynamics from the development of a new mecha so quickly, and to be able to link it to the almost forgotten Professor Shen, this person's academic attainment must be extremely high. Moreover, he is very familiar with Professor Shen, and even, has been secretly observing him all this time." Su Lu lowered his head, thinking seriously. If Zhou Yu's guess was somewhat correct, then he had to admit that the head of the Federal Academy of Science, such a detached figure who was deeply respected by the Federation and whose students were spread across the various key technical departments of the Federation, if he really wanted to steal the fruits of Professor Shen's research, Su Lu would not be able to do anything about it. "How far are you from success with the new mecha you're researching?" Zhou Yu looked seriously into Su Li's eyes. She had always thought that this ordinary small-eyed boy was destined to become someone great, but she really had not expected that this person would shock the entire Federation so soon after entering the research institute. "Not far. Give up on the lab," Zhou Yu said straightforwardly. With regards to the darkness of the upper echelons of the Federation, she had a more direct understanding than Su Lu, who had come from an ordinary background. "Do your best to create the new mecha. As long as it's done, even if it really is the Federal Academy of Science, you won't have to worry about anything. Sulu knew that she was talking about a more practical method, but he did not want to give up on the lab, because it was the crystallization of Professor Shin's wisdom in his later years. Although I'm not far from success, I still need the database in the lab. Without the lab, I can't do anything. Then you have to think of a way to transfer the database out. Zhou Yu looked at him seriously. Don't have any extravagant hopes. I believe that when you return to the research institute tomorrow, you will be transferred out, and in this lifetime, you won't be able to take one step closer to the lab. It was an impossible task to move the huge database in the laboratory from the Nutshell Research Institute, which was heavily guarded and had 3 layers of scanning. Although Sulu trusted Zhou Yu's sharp judgment as an unmarried mother, he did not think in this direction. But the next day, when a group of fully armed military police ordered him to report to the Human Resources Department immediately, he understood that he had to do as Zhou Yu said. Sulu looked at the military police in front of him silently. For the first time, he felt that it was difficult to reason with the old system of the Federation. Professor Shin believed that everything in the universe should be reasonable, so he was plagiarized, ostracized, and forgotten in a lonely laboratory.